Introduction. Throughout the grand theater of our lives, we are continually forced to confront individuals who bring chaos, manipulation, and unnecessary pain into our daily existence. Some of these figures hold power over us as leaders or superiors. Others operate as colleagues or even pose as friends. They may wield their influence through overt aggression or mask it beneath layers of passive-aggressive maneuvering, but their ultimate weapon is always their mastery over our emotional landscape. They dazzle us with an intoxicating charm, presenting themselves as uniquely confident and brimming with visionary ideas. Caught in their magnetic pull, we lower our defenses. It is only after the damage is inflicted that we recognize their supreme confidence was a hollow shell and their grand designs were profoundly flawed. In professional spheres, these are the individuals who quietly sabotage our progress, driven by a secret, corrosive envy, or who brazenly utilize our efforts as mere stepping stones for their own boundless ambition. When the mask finally slips, we are left caught off guard, bewildered by behavior we never anticipated. These instigators are remarkably adept at weaving elaborate cover stories, justifying their betrayals with seamless logic, or pointing their fingers at convenient scapegoats. They drag us into their manufactured dramas, confusing our senses and leaving us feeling utterly helpless. We may protest, we may harbor bitter anger, but the emotional toll has already been extracted, and just as we recover, another figure of the exact same mold enters our orbit, and the destructive cycle begins anew. This profound sense of confusion and lack of control is not merely confined to our interactions with others. It intimately plagues our relationship with ourselves. We all experience moments where we act in ways that baffle our own conscious minds. A sudden sharp remark escapes our lips, offending a colleague or deeply wounding a friend, and we are left wondering where such unexpected venom originated. We throw our vital energy into a sweeping project or a passionate romance, ignoring all rational warnings, only to awaken later to the painful realization that the endeavor was remarkably foolish and self-destructive. In these terrifying moments, it feels as though we harbor a stranger within our own minds, a dark, autonomous entity that bypasses our willpower and compels us toward ruin. When confronted with the bewildering actions of others or our own inexplicable missteps, our instinctive reaction is to grasp at the simplest, most superficial explanations. We label the other person a sociopath or inherently evil. We excuse ourselves by claiming we were simply out of character, overwhelmed by a momentary lapse. But these convenient fictions offer no genuine understanding. They are merely soothing stories that guarantee we will fall victim to the exact same patterns again. We are creatures bound to the surface of existence, reacting emotionally to the immediate friction of human interaction while remaining entirely blind to the vast subterranean currents that actually dictate our behavior. Imagine, however, the immense power that would come from plunging beneath this turbulent surface and gazing upon the deep, hidden roots of human motivation. What if we could clearly perceive the invisible machinery that transforms a colleague's insecurity into active sabotage, or understand the profound inner emptiness that drives a leader's grandiose delusions? What if we could trace our own sudden explosions of anger or our desperate, irrational infatuations back to their true origins in our distant past? If we truly comprehended this primal architecture, the manipulators and toxic personalities of the world would lose their hold over us. We would anticipate their maneuvers before they were even executed, seeing through their elaborate justifications with cold, surgical precision. We would refuse to surrender our emotional energy to their dramas, starving them of the attention they require to survive. We would finally judge people not by the dazzling masks they present, but by the undeniable strength and reality of their underlying character. Turning this penetrating vision inward would be equally transformative. By encountering that hidden stranger within, by acknowledging that our dark, compulsive impulses are not alien invasions, but deeply woven threads of our own complex nature, we would finally acquire the leverage needed to break our most destructive cycles. We would cease making pathetic excuses for our failures and begin to exert genuine conscious control over our trajectory. To embark on this profound psychological excavation, we must first shatter our most deeply cherished illusion, the belief that our behavior is primarily conscious and governed by our rational will. The unsettling truth is that we are relentlessly driven by forces operating far below the threshold of our awareness. We experience the final results, the sudden mood swing, the flash of anger, the overwhelming desire, but we remain entirely ignorant of the intricate biological and evolutionary mechanisms that triggered them. Our anger, for example, may seem inextricably linked to the person standing before us, but its true genesis often lies buried in an unresolved childhood wound or a complex web of environmental pressures that we cannot currently see. In the heat of the moment, we do not analyze. We simply ride the emotional wave and lash out. We must recognize that this vast collection of hidden drives, this human nature, is the direct product of our evolutionary history. For millions of years, our survival as a species depended entirely on our ability to function as a highly cohesive social animal. Long before the invention of language, our earliest ancestors communicated through a rich, intricate vocabulary of emotions: joy, shame, resentment, and grief, instantly legible on the face and posture. They were hyper-permeable to the moods of the group, feeling terror or triumph as a unified organism. Today, despite our sophisticated technological veneers, this ancient wiring remains fully intact. We are still remarkably susceptible to the emotional contagion of those around us, unconsciously imitating the group, desiring what others desire, and getting swept away in viral waves of collective outrage, all while maintaining the absolute delusion that we are acting as independent, rational agents. This primal inheritance also burdens us with a desperate, deeply ingrained need to measure our worth against others, a constant calculation of status that we share with our primate cousins. It endows us with a tribal instinct that violently categorizes the world into insiders to be protected and outsiders to be demonized. It forces us to construct elaborate public masks to conceal the dark, antisocial desires we have repressed, the very desires that our ancestors attributed to demonic possession, and which we now vaguely dismiss as momentary losses of control. For millennia, we have stumbled through the dark regarding our own nature, preferring comforting myths of divine origin to the sobering reality of our primate roots. We have aggressively denied our animalistic impulses, cloaking our worst behavior in lofty moral justifications. But we now stand at a unique threshold in human history. We have accumulated a vast, undeniable storehouse of psychological, neurological, and historical knowledge. We can draw upon profound insights into early childhood development, the mechanics of narcissism, the structure of the shadow self, and the neurobiology of emotion. By synthesizing this immense body of knowledge, we can construct an unsparing, brutally realistic codebook for deciphering the entirety of human behavior. This endeavor requires identifying the elemental forces, the immutable laws that predictably govern how we react to the world. We must confront our inescapable irrationality, our desperate narcissism, our crippling short-sightedness, and our terrifying conformity. We must not fall for the arrogant assumption that our modern, enlightened age has somehow transcended this primitive programming. The reality is precisely the opposite. We have never been more vulnerable to the destructive potential of our own nature. Social media and constant digital connectivity have only amplified our emotional permeability, creating an ideal breeding ground for manipulative demagogues, tribal intimidation, and explosive, unchecked aggression. Human nature remains infinitely more powerful than any institution or technology we invent. It bends our greatest creations to serve its own primal ends. To ignore these ancient laws is to voluntarily surrender control, condemning oneself to a life of endless confusion and victimization. By immersing yourself deeply in the study of these laws, a radical transformation of your perspective will occur. You will cease reacting to the abrasive behavior of others with personal anxiety and exhausting emotional drama, recognizing that people are largely driven by deep-seated neuroses and childhood traumas that have absolutely nothing to do with you. You will learn to observe their hostility and manipulation with the calm, detached fascination of a scientist examining a peculiar specimen. You will become a master decoder of the subtle non-verbal cues that constantly leak through people's polished masks, allowing you to accurately judge their true character and anticipate their betrayals before they occur. Furthermore, you will acquire the psychological armor necessary to outmaneuver the toxic personalities that cross your path, rendering their intimidation tactics and guilt trips utterly ineffective. You will discover the true, counterintuitive levers of influence, learning to gently dismantle people's defensive walls by validating their deepest self-opinions rather than aggressively attacking their beliefs. Crucially, this journey will strip away your own hypocrisies. You will be forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that you, too, are driven by these exact same dark impulses. But this realization will not bring despair, it will bring profound liberation. By accepting your complete, flawed humanity, you will gain the power to break your own self-sabotaging patterns. Finally, you will awaken the dormant empathic powers you possessed as an infant. forging connections of unparalleled depth with those around you, and ultimately tapping into the highest, most rational and creative version of yourself that is waiting to be realized. Chapter 1. Master your emotional self. You like to imagine yourself in control of your fate, consciously planning the course of your life as best you can. But you are largely unaware of how deeply your emotions dominate you. They make you veer toward ideas that soothe your ego. They make you look for evidence that confirms what you already want to believe. They make you see what you want to see, depending on your mood, and this disconnect from reality is the source of the bad decisions and negative patterns that haunt your life. Rationality is the ability to counteract these emotional effects, to think instead of react, to open your mind to what is really happening as opposed to what you are feeling. It does not come naturally. It is a power we must cultivate, but in doing so we realize our greatest potential. To understand the profound stakes of this internal struggle, we must cast our gaze back to the winter of 432 BC. The city-state of Athens faced an existential crisis. The rival power of Sparta, a fiercely militaristic and oligarchic society, had delivered a harsh ultimatum: submit to their new terms of peace or face devastating war. The Athenian Assembly, a democratic gathering of thousands of citizens, convened on the Nix Hill to debate their survival. The atmosphere was charged with panic and heated rhetoric. Hawks demanded an immediate offensive, eager to seize the initiative, while doves pleaded for conciliation, terrified of the Spartan war machine. Amidst this chaotic storm of fear and anger, the elder statesman Pericles stepped forward. Pericles was a singular figure in Athenian politics. Unlike the firebrands who thrived on dramatic speeches and factionalism, he was a philosopher-statesman. He had risen to power not by catering to the elite, but by empowering the working classes, the farmers and oarsmen who formed the backbone of the Athenian Empire. Under his quiet, unobtrusive leadership, Athens had entered a golden age, funneling surplus wealth into breathtaking public works, most notably the Parthenon, dedicated to Athena, the goddess of practical wisdom and martial strategy. Pericles embodied this goddess's spirit. His speaking style was remarkably restrained, devoid of emotional manipulation, relying instead on the compelling force of airtight logic. Addressing the agitated crowd, Pericles refused to be swayed by the prevailing panic. He argued against the illusion that a direct land battle with the formidable Spartan army could end in anything but slaughter. Instead, he proposed a radical, counterintuitive strategy: abandon the countryside, retreat within the impregnable walls of Athens, and rely entirely on their unrivaled navy to secure supplies and harass the Spartan coastline. He foresaw that the Spartans, unable to force a decisive battle, would eventually exhaust their resources and political will. The assembly, calmed by his unshakable reason, approved the plan. For a time, the strategy held, but the unpredictable nature of reality soon intervened. A devastating plague swept through the overcrowded city, killing a third of the population, including Pericles himself. With his stabilizing presence gone, the Athenians quickly succumbed to their basest emotions. Blaming their departed leader, they abandoned his defensive strategy and embraced the passionate, reckless rhetoric of the war party. This descent into irrationality culminated in the disastrous Sicilian expedition years later. Driven by greed and the delusion of invincibility, the Athenians launched a massive armada to conquer Syracuse, a Spartan ally. When commanders warned of the immense risks and the need for an impossibly large force, the citizenry, blinded by the scent of triumph and untold riches, did not pull back. They merely doubled the size of the fleet. The expedition ended in absolute ruin. The armada was obliterated and the golden age of Athens crumbled into dust, a victim not merely of Spartan might, but of its own unbridled emotional impulses. The tragedy of Athens serves as a profound mirror for the human condition. Pericles understood a fundamental truth. The political figures around him believed themselves to be rational actors pursuing logical goals, yet their collective decisions routinely birthed chaos and self-destruction. They were driven not by reason, but by the primal hunger for power, attention, and wealth. Pericles escaped this trap by cultivating what the ancient Greeks called nous, a divine, ordering intelligence. For him, this was embodied by Athena. To channel this inner Athena, he trained himself to never react in the heat of the moment, never making a decision while under the influence of a strong emotion. He retreated into solitude to analyze his feelings, allowing the initial waves of anger or insecurity to dissipate until a clear, objective path revealed itself. We too labor under the delusion of our own rationality. We are constantly buffeted by the dramas of others, reacting to stimuli with spikes of anxiety, excitement, or defensiveness. When our plans unravel, our instinctive reaction is to seek external culprits. We blame malicious colleagues, antagonistic systems, or simply bad luck. These convenient fictions shield our egos, but blind us to the true architect of our misfortunes, our own irrationality. Consider the catastrophic financial crashes that periodically shatter the global economy. In the aftermath, pundits endlessly debate regulatory failures and complex market dynamics, yet they willfully ignore the contagion of greed and the intoxicating lure of easy wealth that overwhelm the critical faculties of millions of individuals making daily investment decisions. Bubbles inflate and burst because no regulatory framework can constrain the primal forces of human nature. To begin the arduous journey toward rationality, we must first accept the inescapable reality of our emotional wiring. For millions of years, our ancestors relied on instantaneous, instinctive reactions for survival. A rustle in the brush triggered a chemical surge, compelling immediate flight. As social dynamics grew more complex, these arousals evolved into profound emotional states serving as vital communicative tools within the tribe. However, the cognitive, language-producing centers of our brains evolved much later, layered atop this ancient, emotive architecture. This evolutionary stratification results in a constant internal friction. We experience physical arousals and attempt to translate them into the abstract language of thought, but this translation is notoriously flawed. We may perceive our feeling as anger toward a colleague when it is truly rooted in a deeply repressed sense of inferiority or envy. We project unresolved childhood traumas onto present circumstances, reacting to ghosts rather than reality. This is the essence of our irrationality, an emotional self that operates autonomously, driving our behavior while we weave elaborate rationalizations to convince ourselves that we are in control. The path toward true rationality requires an unflinching examination of our own mental machinery. It begins with recognizing the low-grade irrationality that infects our daily thoughts through a series of deeply ingrained cognitive biases. We are constantly seeking pleasure and avoiding pain in our thinking, and this pleasure principle distorts our perception. The most pervasive of these distortions is the confirmation bias. We form beliefs based on deep-seated desires and then meticulously curate the evidence to validate them, ignoring any data that contradicts our preferred narrative. We see this in business plans constructed on impossibly rosy scenarios, and in our tendency to seek advice only to have our preconceived notions echoed back to us. We imagine we are looking for the truth, but we are actually holding on to ideas that bring a release from tension and soothe our egos. Closely related is the conviction bias. When we harbor secret doubts about an idea, we often compensate by expressing it with overwhelming, aggressive certainty. We conflate the intensity of our passion with the objective truth of our position, telling ourselves that an idea must be true if it brings out such fierce energy to defend it. This makes us highly vulnerable to demagogues and salespeople who wield theatrical conviction to bypass our critical faculties. We are also victims of the appearance bias, fundamentally failing to recognize that social existence is a grand theater. We judge people by the carefully constructed masks they present, assuming that a confident demeanor equates to competence, or that a successful individual is inherently ethical. We mistake the polished surface for the messy substance, consistently falling for the halo effect and obscuring the darker realities of human behavior. Furthermore, the group bias exerts a gravitational pull on our intellect. We are social animals by nature, and the terror of isolation compels us to adopt the orthodoxies of our chosen tribes. We experience a profound, unacknowledged relief in finding others who think the way we do, fiercely maintaining the illusion that our heavily synthesized opinions are the product of independent thought. When confronted with our own failures, the blame bias activates our defensive shields. Honest introspection is agonizing. It pokes at our ego and calls into question our superiority. Therefore, we instinctively attribute our mistakes to external circumstances or the flaws of others, ensuring that we never truly learn from our missteps and are doomed to repeat them in endless negative patterns. Finally, the superiority bias is the grand illusion that we alone are exempt from these cognitive distortions. We readily identify the irrationality and tactical maneuvering in others, while deeply believing in our own inherent rationality and moral purity. Until we dismantle this self-serving myth, the quest for self-mastery cannot truly begin. Beyond the constant hum of these low-grade biases, we must remain vigilant against a second, more volatile force: the inflaming factors that trigger high-grade irrationality. These are intense reactive states sparked by specific external pressures that tunnel our vision and provoke disastrous actions. The most potent of these origin points are the trigger points from early childhood. Deep-seated vulnerabilities and wounds formed in our most sensitive years remain buried in our psyche. A seemingly innocuous comment in the present can suddenly resurrect the profound terror of childhood abandonment or the sting of early humiliation. When we react with a sudden, disproportionate intensity, with uncharacteristic tears, withdrawal, or explosive rage, we are no longer responding to the present moment. We are physically reliving a historical trauma, misreading reality, and damaging our current relationships in the process. We must also be wary of sudden gains or losses. An unexpected windfall or a rapid ascent to success floods the brain with intoxicating chemicals, fostering a dangerous grandiosity. We lose sight of the role of luck and the unglamorous necessity of hard work, becoming addicted to the high and blinding ourselves to the inevitable, painful fall. Conversely, a string of losses can paralyze us with fear, creating a hesitant mindset that leads to further mistakes. We must deliberately cultivate pessimism in times of sudden triumph and optimism in the depths of defeat. Rising pressure is another profound inflamer. As stress mounts, the civilized veneer crumbles and the primitive survivalist regions of the brain commandeer our faculties. People who appear calm in tranquil times will suddenly reveal paranoid, brittle, and petty traits under duress. We must monitor our own stress levels, recognizing our inherent lack of immunity to pressure, and deliberately carve out moments of solitude to regain perspective. Certain individuals act as inflaming factors themselves. These highly charismatic but often deeply narcissistic personalities project their internal chaos outward, drawing others into their extreme orbits of devotion or hatred. They overwhelm our reasoning, demanding constant mental real estate. When we encounter individuals who seemingly strip us of our objectivity, we must forcefully demythologize them, looking past their larger-than-life myth to the mundane, very human insecurities that actually drive them. Lastly, the group effect magnifies our irrationality to a terrifying degree. Submerged in a crowd or swept up in a viral online outrage, our independent thought dissolves into the collective emotion. We become highly susceptible to demagogues who trade in vague, emotive language and foster a perpetual state of panic. Our only defense is a fierce, almost resentful guarding of our intellectual independence when we sense the gravitational pull of the mob. Despite these formidable challenges, the transformation into a deeply rational being is entirely within your grasp. It is not an ascetic denial of emotion, but the attainment of a dynamic balance achieved through specific, deliberate strategies designed to bring out your rational self. The foundational step is to know yourself thoroughly. The emotional self derives its power from operating in the dark, thriving on your ignorance. You must ruthlessly examine your own patterns, identifying how you behave under stress, and uncovering the deep-seated insecurities that drive your poorest decisions. This unvarnished self-appraisal, embracing your unique strengths and your glaring weaknesses, strips the emotional self of its covert control. Simultaneously, you must examine your emotions to their roots. When anger or resentment flares, do not simply ride the wave and point fingers. Force yourself to trace the feeling downward. Is that sudden irritation truly about a trivial slight? Or is it masking a deeper, more uncomfortable emotion like envy or paranoia? Dig below your trigger points to discover their true genesis. Maintaining a journal with ruthless objectivity can aid in this excavation, helping you pierce the comforting illusions your ego constructs. Crucially, you must increase your reaction time. This is the resistance training of the mind. When provoked or confronted with a situation demanding a response, train yourself to step back, sleep on the angry email, delay the crucial commitment. The simple act of imposing time between a stimulus and your response suffocates the reactive impulse and creates the necessary mental space for perspective to arrive. Furthermore, learn to accept people as facts. We exhaust immense emotional energy wishing people were different, judging them against our own arbitrary standards, and projecting our own values onto them. Instead, view your fellow humans as neutral phenomena, as varied and unalterable as plants or comets. They simply exist. When you stop struggling to change their fundamental nature, you can observe them dispassionately, transforming interactions from a source of frustration into a fascinating puzzle to be solved. This radical acceptance breeds a profound internal calm. The ultimate goal is to find the optimal balance of thinking and emotion. Remember the ancient Greek metaphor of the rider and the horse. Your emotional nature is the horse, a source of immense, untamed energy and driving force. Your rational mind is the rider, guiding that energy with disciplined intent through training and practice. Without the rider, the horse runs wild into danger. Without the horse, the rider has no momentum. Before acting, apply rigorous skepticism and intense deliberation. But once a course is chosen, loosen the reins and execute with boldness and a spirit of adventure. Finally, you must love the rational. Do not view the path of self-mastery as a painful, joyless chore. Recognize it as the source of a profound, enduring satisfaction. The clarity, the deep focus, the ability to transcend petty conflicts, and the sheer effectiveness of your actions will bring a pleasure far richer than the fleeting, manic distractions the world offers. Cultivate a deep reverence for your own reasoning powers, and let the voice of your inner Athena be the guiding force of your existence. Chapter 2. Transform self-love into empathy. Human beings are endowed with a profound and almost mystical instrument for social connection and power: empathy. When properly cultivated, this capacity allows us to peer into the minds and moods of those around us, anticipating their actions and gently dismantling their resistance. Yet, this remarkable tool is frequently blunted by our own innate self-absorption. Every one of us resides on a spectrum of narcissism. Our life's mission must be to come to terms with this foundational self-love and to learn the delicate art of turning our sensitivity outward rather than endlessly inward. Simultaneously, we must develop the acute vision required to identify the toxic narcissists who cross our paths, preventing ourselves from becoming entangled in their chaotic dramas and poisoned by their underlying envy. From the instant we take our first breath, we are driven by an insatiable hunger for attention. As social creatures to our very core, our survival and our deepest sense of happiness rely on the bonds we forge. Without the gaze of others, without feeling their focus upon us, we risk a descent into profound psychological darkness. Eye contact and recognition are not merely physical necessities, they are the bedrock of our self-worth. We feel alive and validated only when we are acknowledged for who we are. Yet a universal problem immediately presents itself. Attention is a finite resource. In childhood, we vie with siblings. In adulthood, we compete with colleagues and peers. The world is largely indifferent to our individual fate, preoccupied with its own struggles. If we relied entirely on the constant validation of others, we would be left drained, desperate, and ultimately repulsed by the very people whose gaze we seek. To resolve this existential dilemma, the human mind constructs a brilliant survival mechanism. We create a cohesive sense of self. We forge an internal image comprised of our tastes, values, and worldviews. We emphasize our strengths and rationalize our weaknesses. When this process is successful, we build a self-image that we can genuinely love and rely upon. This internal thermostat regulates our insecurities. When the world ignores us, we can retreat into this self-love, soothing our own doubts without needing constant external applause. We develop what is commonly known as self-esteem. However, not everyone successfully develops this internal thermostat. In the crucial developmental years, between the ages of 2 and 5, as children begin to separate from their mothers and face the harsh reality of an indifferent world, they must internalize the soothing and strengthening qualities of their caregivers. If this early development is shattered, either through the cold abandonment of a self-absorbed parent or the suffocating enmeshment of an over-involved one, the child fails to build a solid, independent self. These individuals become what we might call deep narcissists. Lacking a cohesive internal core to love and rely upon, they are entirely dependent on the attention of others to feel whole. If these deep narcissists are extroverted, they may become theatrical masters of monopolizing a room, feeding their dangerous addiction to the spotlight. If introverted, they retreat into grandiose fantasy worlds, constantly oscillating between feeling like a supreme deity and a worthless worm. For deep narcissists, other people are not autonomous human beings, but rather extensions of themselves, mere instruments to be used for validation and control. When their inflated self-image is challenged, they have no internal defense and react with a terrifying, righteous rage, perpetually positioning themselves as the wounded victim. One particularly hazardous variant of this type is the narcissistic leader. Driven by immense ambition, they can initially funnel their desperate need for validation into their work. Their unwavering, albeit fragile, confidence draws followers who mistake their grandiosity for visionary genius. Yet, as their power grows, their internal chaos inevitably spills into the organizations they run. They micromanage, stir up constant drama to remain the center of attention, and ultimately burn down whatever they have built because they cannot tolerate anyone else sharing the stage. Most of humanity, however, resides slightly higher on the spectrum. We are functional narcissists. We possess a stable enough sense of self to absorb the inevitable slights of life. Because we are not completely consumed by our own emotional deficits, we can occasionally direct our focus outward toward our work and the people around us. Our ultimate goal must be to transcend this functional state and evolve into healthy narcissists. The healthy narcissist possesses a self-image so resilient and realistic that it encompasses both their strengths and their glaring flaws. Because they accept themselves fully, they do not require constant validation. This profound inner security liberates their attention, allowing it to flow powerfully outward in two distinct directions: toward their life's work, resulting in great art, invention, and productivity, and toward other people, resulting in the cultivation of deep, active empathy. To develop this empathetic power, we must actively resist the cultural tide of self-absorption, heightened in our era by the isolating effects of technology. True empathy is not merely a passive state, but a skill set comprising distinct components. First, we must adopt the empathetic attitude. This requires us to assume that we are largely ignorant of the true nature of the people we meet. We must suspend our innate tendency to judge and categorize, approaching each individual as an undiscovered country. In conversation, we must silence our internal monologue and cultivate a burning curiosity for the perspective of the other. Second, we must develop visceral empathy. This involves tuning into the physical and emotional frequencies of another person before processing their words. By paying close attention to their body language, vocal tone, and facial expressions, we engage our mirror neurons. We subtly mimic their physical state to actually feel their emotions from the inside out, establishing a profound, almost hypnotic rapport. Third, we must apply analytic empathy. Visceral connections are powerful but can be misleading without context. We must gather information about a person's background, their relationship with their parents, their deeply held values, and the experiences that shaped them. By combining the physical sensation of their mood with the analytical understanding of their history, we gain a remarkably accurate map of their inner world. Finally, we must continually hone our empathetic skill through practice and feedback, learning to seamlessly shift between the visceral and the analytical, allowing our understanding of others to remain fluid and alive. We can observe the chilling dynamics of deep narcissism in those who seek complete control over their environment, a type perfectly embodied by the Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. In his early years in power, Stalin presented an exceptionally charming and accessible front. He engaged his lieutenants with intense, probing attention, making each man feel singularly important. He played the role of the humble proletarian, quick to share an earthy joke and a warm embrace. Yet beneath this carefully constructed facade lay an emotional abyss. When a close confidant, Sergei Kirov, inadvertently revealed that he might be more popular than the premier, Stalin's underlying insecurity was triggered. The warmth instantly evaporated, replaced by a lethal coldness. Kirov was soon assassinated, a murder almost certainly orchestrated by Stalin, marking the beginning of the Great Purge. The very men who had basked in his affection were tortured and executed, while Stalin delighted in accounts of their desperate, weeping pleas for his forgiveness. As his paranoia deepened, he micromanaged every detail of the Soviet state and the war effort, establishing a terrifying environment where his subordinates were trapped in double binds, paralyzed by the fear of either contradicting him or appearing too sycophantic. Complete control narcissists use their intense sensitivity not to connect with others, but to probe for weaknesses. They offer an intoxicating simulated empathy to draw victims in, only to withdraw it capriciously, manipulating the emotions of their followers and keeping them off balance until the psychological domination is absolute. A different manifestation is the theatrical narcissist, exemplified by the 17th century French nun Jeanne de Belciel. Lacking physical advantages but possessing a sharp, malicious intelligence, Jeanne recognized early on that she could acquire the attention she so desperately craved by playing dramatic roles. Assigned to an Ursuline convent in Loudun, she transformed herself into a paragon of mystical piety, earning the position of prioress. When the routine of her duties failed to satisfy her hunger for the spotlight, she initiated a spectacular drama, claiming she was visited and possessed by the demonic spirits sent by a handsome local priest, Urbain Grandier. Her writhing, obscene public exorcisms became the premier entertainment of the region. Even after her false accusations led to Grandier being burned at the stake, Jeanne could not bear to relinquish the stage. She seamlessly shifted her role from demonic victim to living saint, claiming miraculous anointments and displaying stigmata on her hands. She leveraged these supposed divine interventions to embark on a grand European tour, celebrated by royalty and commoners alike. The theatrical narcissist disguises their boundless need for attention behind a mask of intense suffering, profound morality, or extreme victimhood. They are consummate actors who utilize the empathy of others as fuel for their endless personal dramas, turning everyone around them into supporting cast members in a play that must never end. Narcissism is not merely an individual affliction, it can profoundly infect the dynamic between two people, creating the nightmare of the narcissistic couple. The marriage of the great Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy and his much younger wife Sonia illustrates this tragic pattern. From the very beginning of their union, when Tolstoy forced his young bride to read his diaries detailing his youthful debaucheries, the relationship was marked by a catastrophic lack of mutual empathy. As Tolstoy aged and plunged into a severe spiritual crisis, he decided to renounce his wealth, copyrights, and aristocratic lifestyle to live as a simple peasant. He demanded that his family join him in this asceticism. To Sonia, who had dedicated her life to managing his estate and raising their children, this was a cruel, hypocritical betrayal. To Tolstoy, her resistance was proof of her shallow materialism. Instead of attempting to view the situation through the other's value system, each retreated into entrenched defensive postures. They engaged in a bitter, decades-long war of psychological attrition, reading each other's private journals, provoking guilt, and weaponizing their children. Their mutual self-absorption blinded them to the genuine pain the other was experiencing. A narcissistic relationship is defined by this exact dynamic, a total inability to step outside one's own emotional framework, causing both partners to constantly trigger the other's deepest insecurities, transforming what could be a bond of mutual support into a prison of perpetual resentment. In stark contrast to these destructive patterns stands the healthy narcissist, someone who utilizes the full spectrum of human empathy to achieve monumental results. The explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton faced a catastrophic crisis in 1915 when his ship, the Endurance, was crushed by Antarctic ice, leaving his crew stranded in a frozen, sunless wasteland. Shackleton understood that the survival of his men depended entirely on their morale. If panic or resentment took root, they would perish. To prevent this, he had to master the mood of the group. He began with himself, carefully suppressing his own tremendous anxieties and projecting an aura of supreme, unshakable confidence. He then turned his focus entirely outward, becoming an acute observer of his crew. He engaged them individually, tailoring his conversations to their unique interests, sensing the subtle physical cues of depression or idleness. He strategically managed the group dynamics, placing potential malcontents in his own tent to monitor them and neutralize their influence. When a crew member's spirit faltered, Shackleton did not scold or humiliate him. Instead, he anticipated the emotional collapse and provided a sudden, comforting distraction, like a ration of hot milk, preserving the man's dignity while lifting his mood. By dissolving his own ego and attuning himself utterly to the psychic state of his men, Shackleton achieved one of the greatest feats of survival in human history. He demonstrates that our dormant, empathetic powers can be awakened when we recognize that our success, and sometimes our very survival, depends entirely on our ability to accurately read and guide the inner lives of those around us. Chapter 3. See through people's masks. Every individual you encounter walks the stage of life wearing a carefully crafted disguise. We present ourselves as accommodating, secure, and dedicated, saying precisely what the occasion demands while offering warm smiles and attentive nods. We master the art of masking our deepest insecurities, our simmering resentments, and our inevitable envies. If you accept these polished exteriors as the absolute truth, you are moving blindly through the world. You will inevitably be struck by sudden betrayals, inexplicable hostilities, and manipulative maneuvers that seem to materialize out of nowhere. Yet these facades are inherently fragile. Because human beings cannot exercise perfect control over their physiology, their authentic emotions and hidden desires constantly leak through the cracks of their masks. These involuntary signals appear in micro-expressions, the pitch of a voice, the rigidity of a posture, or a restless hand. To navigate the social landscape safely, you must transform yourself into a supreme decoder of this non-verbal language. By reading the subtle cues that others cannot suppress, you arm yourself with the foresight needed for self-defense. Simultaneously, because the world judges you by your exterior, you must become a master of the stage, learning the fine art of impression management to command your role with flawless precision. In the late summer of 1919, a 17-year-old boy named Milton Erickson awoke in his rural Wisconsin home to a terrifying reality. His body was succumbing to a creeping paralysis. Stricken by the devastating polio epidemic of the era, he soon found himself entirely immobilized. As he lay trapped in his bed, he overheard a grim conversation in the adjacent room. A visiting physician was quietly assuring his mother that the boy would not survive until morning. Desperate to distract his mother from her impending grief, Erickson requested that a mirror be angled just so, allowing him to watch the sunset from his bed. He determined that if he could just hold on to the light, he might endure the night. Miraculously, he outlived the doctor's prognosis, awakening from a coma days later. Though he had cheated death, the virus had stripped him of all movement. He could not speak, he could not shift his limbs. His entire physical agency was reduced to the mere movement of his eyes. Isolated in his farmhouse bedroom, surrounded by a bustling family of siblings and parents, the young man faced an agonizing boredom. However, this absolute physical stillness birthed an extraordinary cognitive awakening. Unable to participate in the lively chatter around him, Erickson began to watch his family with a ferocious, unbroken attention. He started to notice peculiar discrepancies between what his sisters said and what their bodies communicated. A sibling might agree to a proposal with a definitive verbal affirmation, yet the slight tightening of her jaw, the dull monotone of her voice, and the briefest hesitation in her posture screamed a resounding rejection. He witnessed an offering of an apple between sisters, accompanied by words of generosity, but betrayed by a rigid arm and a subtle tension in the face that clearly communicated a desire to keep the fruit. Fascinated by this hidden realm of communication, Erickson devoted his waking hours to studying this silent symphony. He noted how the veins on a person's neck would throb when they felt uncomfortable in his presence. He correlated specific breathing rhythms with the onset of boredom. He observed the difference between an impatient, sweeping stroke of the hair and a gentle, unconscious touch that signaled deep engagement. He began anticipating people's true desires before they even voiced them, simply by decoding the unspoken tension in their frames and the shifting cadence of their speech. It was as if his paralysis had granted him access to a subterranean language, a continuous flow of profound, unfiltered truth running just beneath the facade of polite conversation. Eventually, through sheer willpower and agonizingly slow mental exercises, Erickson managed to coax movement back into his muscles, teaching himself to walk again. He carried this profound revelation into his adult life, becoming a pioneering psychiatrist. Unlike his contemporaries, who relied almost exclusively on the verbal confessions of their patients, Erickson focused intently on the physical form. He positioned his desk to observe how patients carried themselves as they walked across the room. The heaviness of a step, the tightness of a gripped chair arm, the direction of a gaze, these provided him with an instant, visceral map of their deepest psychological blockages. In one remarkable instance, he diagnosed a woman's secret infidelity before she even spoke of her marriage, simply by observing the tightly locked, defensive posture of her ankles. He could deduce professions, hidden anxieties, and suppressed traumas entirely from the way a person occupied space. To observers, his insights appeared almost mystical, but they were simply the result of an intense, practiced mastery of the second language. Erickson's extraordinary journey highlights a fundamental tragedy of the human condition. We are inherently social creatures, utterly dependent on our connections for survival, yet we ignore the vast majority of the information transmitted to us. We fixate obsessively on words, treating them as the primary vehicle of truth, when in reality, language is most often deployed as an instrument of concealment. Words distract, justify, and obscure. To remain bound by the spoken word is to live in a state of perilous ignorance. You must undergo an awakening similar to Erickson's, recognizing that every human interaction is deeply physical. People are constantly vibrating with emotional data, signaling their fears, their hostilities, and their desires through a medium they cannot consciously govern. To acquire this penetrating vision, you do not need to learn a foreign skill. You must merely reclaim a power you possessed in your infancy. As helpless children, our survival hinged entirely on our ability to interpret the moods and intentions of the giants who ruled our world. We watch their faces with rapt attention, instantly detecting the difference between a genuine smile of affection and the forced grin of polite irritation. We were acute judges of character, uniquely capable of sensing malevolence behind a friendly facade. Yet, as we matured and our egos solidified, we turned our gaze inward. We became obsessed with our own thoughts, our own anxieties, and how others perceived us. We traded the expansive, outward-looking curiosity of childhood for the narrow, self-absorbed tunnel vision of adulthood. The process of reversing this inward gaze requires deliberate, patient rewiring of your mental habits. Begin with modest, manageable goals. When engaged in casual conversation, silence your internal monologue. Cease formulating your next brilliant remark and instead direct your complete focus onto the other person. Start by observing the face. Watch for the fleeting micro-expressions that contradict the spoken narrative. Notice the tension around the eyes, the slight pursing of the lips. Once you grow comfortable reading the facial canvas, expand your awareness to the voice. The human voice is remarkably difficult to control. Pay attention to sudden shifts in pitch, a sudden acceleration in speech, or a hesitant stutter. Eventually, encompass the entire body. Note the crossed arms, the tapping feet, the torso angled subtly toward the exit. Crucially, your observation must never feel clinical or predatory. If people sense they are being scrutinized, they will instantly freeze, their defensive shields rising to obscure the very cues you seek to read. You must remain relaxed, maintaining natural eye contact, utilizing peripheral vision to capture the subtle twitch of a hand or the shifting of weight. To interpret these signs accurately, you must first establish a person's baseline. Every individual possesses a default demeanor. Some are naturally effusive and kinetic, while others are chronically tense or profoundly stoic. You cannot detect a deviation unless you know the norm. Once you understand their baseline, a sudden plunge into silence from a normally talkative colleague or an uncharacteristic burst of animation from a quiet acquaintance becomes a blazing siren of hidden emotional activity. As you practice this art, you must remain vigilant against your own psychological biases. We are highly susceptible to seeing what we wish to see. If you harbor a subconscious dislike for someone, you will eagerly interpret their nervous fidgeting as proof of deceit or malice. Conversely, you will forgive the glaringly aggressive posture of someone you admire. Furthermore, you must avoid the trap of rushing to definitive conclusions based on a single cue. A nervous tremor does not necessarily indicate guilt. It may simply signify social anxiety or intimidation. Your task is to gather a cluster of signals, to note the context, and to observe patterns over time before rendering a judgment. As you venture into this hidden world, you will discover that human beings continually emit signals that betray their true intentions. These cues broadly fall into three critical categories: the spectrum of like and dislike, the dynamics of dominance and submission, and the subtle indicators of deception. Hostility and resentment rarely detonate without prior warning. The signs are always there, simmering beneath the surface of collegial interactions. When a colleague harbors secret envy or animosity, their polite mask will inevitably slip, often in the form of micro-expressions. These are lightning-fast contractions of the facial muscles, a momentary sneer, a downward pull of the lips, a cold narrowing of the eyes that vanish almost as quickly as they appear, hastily replaced by a strained smile. These flashes occur because the conscious mind is slightly slower than the primal emotional response. If you share news of a personal triumph, watch their eyes closely. The genuine friend's face will illuminate with spontaneous joy. The secret rival will register a split second of disappointment or sourness before stretching their mouth into an obligatory congratulation. Pay deep attention to mixed signals. If someone praises your work, but their eyes remain dead and their posture is defensively closed, trust the body, never the words. The physical form is incapable of sustaining a lie without revealing the underlying friction. Conversely, when someone feels genuine affinity or attraction toward you, their physiological defenses drop. The muscles around their mouth and forehead relax. If the emotion is strong, blood flow increases, bringing a flush to the skin. Their pupils will dilate, an involuntary response signaling a desire to take in more of your presence. Their vocal pitch will often rise, infused with a natural warmth and a rapid, eager pacing. Most profoundly, they will begin to unconsciously mirror your behavior. If you lean in, they lean in. If you cross your legs, they follow suit. This physical synchrony is the ultimate manifestation of rapport, a clear indicator that their psychological resistance has crumbled. Beyond the realm of affection lies the perpetual human struggle for status. Though modern society masks its hierarchies behind egalitarian rhetoric, our primate brains remain obsessed with dominance and submission. Those who feel secure in their power project a distinct physical aura. They occupy space with relaxed entitlement. Their movements are expansive, their gaze steady and unhurried. They feel permitted to interrupt, to dictate the pace of conversation, and their smiles are deployed sparingly, not as a nervous plea for approval, but as a deliberate reward. When confronting alpha personalities, you will notice their propensity to assert control through the firm grip of a handshake, the purposeful stride, and the unspoken expectation that others will yield the floor. Yet true power must be distinguished from the brittle posturing of the insecure. Leaders plagued by self-doubt betray their anxiety through a rigid physical stiffness or a manic over-assertion of their presence. Their voices may tighten, their eyes darting nervously as they seek validation. They engage in pacifying behaviors, stroking their necks, rubbing their faces, attempting to physically soothe their churning internal panic. A truly dominant individual does not need to manufacture an intimidating front. Their authority radiates from a core of genuine self-possession. Perhaps the most crucial skill in decoding human nature is the ability to spot deception. Manipulators and con artists exploit our natural human gullibility, our deep-seated desire to trust and to believe in miraculous outcomes. When people are actively attempting to deceive, they generally adopt one of two polarized fronts. The first is the hyper-animated distraction. They bombard you with effusive charm, exaggerated smiles, and fervent, impassioned declarations of their honesty. They wield conviction as a weapon, hoping the sheer volume of their righteous energy will overwhelm your critical faculties. The second approach is the meticulously crafted facade of the bland professional. They present a story so seamless, so saturated with statistics and logical progressions that it feels impervious to doubt. Your defense against both strategies is to search for the physical dissonance. When the enthusiastic deceiver flashes a massive smile, look to their eyes. They will likely remain cold, uncrinkled, and watchful. Their emphatic gestures, pounding a fist, leaning forward, will often occur a fraction of a second after the spoken word, revealing the action as a calculated performance rather than an organic emotional outburst. When dealing with the hyper-rational liar, probe for the tension required to maintain such a flawless front. Do not challenge them directly. Instead, encourage them to weave their web, feigning absolute belief. Then unexpectedly introduce a sharp, uncomfortable question. The sudden shock will shatter their rehearsed script, and in that moment of cognitive overload, their mask will crack, revealing the terrified, scrambling truth beneath. While you must become a ruthless observer of the masks worn by others, you must simultaneously master the creation of your own. The concept of authenticity is one of the most pervasive and damaging myths of our modern era. The belief that we should always express our unfiltered thoughts and naked emotions in the professional and public sphere is a recipe for social ruin. If we were entirely transparent, our erratic moods, petty grievances, and fleeting insecurities would alienate everyone around us. Society demands that we play specific roles: the competent leader, the reliable colleague, the steady professional.
Fulfilling these expectations is not an act of deceit. It is the fundamental requirement of civilized human interaction. To navigate the world effectively, you must embrace the theatrical nature of your existence and become a conscious architect of your public persona. This requires learning to wield your own non-verbal cues with deliberate intent. Understand the emotional resonance you wish to project before entering a room. Draw upon the techniques of the method actor. To project confidence, you must summon the physical memory of a time you felt supremely powerful, allowing that internal state to naturally arrange your posture, steady your gaze, and lower the pitch of your voice. Furthermore, you must meticulously tailor your performance to your audience. A masterful leader understands that the front presented to a board of directors must differ subtly from the persona deployed among frontline workers. You must adapt your rhythm, your vocabulary, and your physical energy to harmonize with the specific cultural environment you are navigating. Never underestimate the immense power of absence and mystery within your impression management. If you are constantly visible, constantly vocal, and endlessly predictable, you become banal. Familiarity breeds a subtle contempt. You must cultivate the discipline to withdraw, to ration your presence. By speaking less, the words you do choose carry the weight of rarity. By remaining slightly elusive, you force others to project their own idealizations onto your blank canvas. Finally, recognize that the very word personality originates from the Latin persona, meaning mask. The mask is not a prison, it is a shield and a tool. It protects your vulnerable, private core from the relentless judgment of the world, while simultaneously allowing you to amplify your greatest strengths for public consumption. By perfecting your role, you do not lose yourself. Instead, you gain the power, the influence, and the ultimate freedom to navigate the human theater on your own terms, forever watchful, forever in control. Chapter 4. Determine the strength of people's character. We navigate our social realities harboring a dangerous illusion. We believe that the individuals we interact with are entirely free agents, capable of rational choice in any given moment. When a colleague suddenly betrays us, or a romantic partner repeats a deeply destructive mistake, we are shocked. We listen to their heartfelt apologies and their earnest promises that such an event will never transpire again, and we choose to believe them. We assume that their conscious intent is stronger than their history. This is a profound misunderstanding of human nature. The truth is far more sobering. People are driven by a deeply ingrained, almost inescapable psychological force. This force dictates how they handle adversity, how they work with others, and how they navigate the inevitable frustrations of existence. This invisible engine is their character, and it binds them to the law of compulsive behavior. To understand this law, we must look to the ancient Greek origins of the word character, which literally translates to a stamping tool, or something engraved. Your character is not a loose garment you wear and discard at will. It is a permanent mark etched into the deepest layers of your nervous system. It is formed in the earliest years of life, forged by the nature of your attachments to your parents, the coping mechanisms you developed to survive your specific childhood environment, and the genetic predispositions you inherited. By the time you reach adulthood, this internal wiring is largely set. While people can consciously adapt their manners and polish their public facades, beneath that thin veneer lies a compulsion to repeat the same fundamental actions, to seek out the same types of relationships, and to sabotage themselves in the exact same manner they always have. When the pressure rises, the conscious will exhaust itself, the polished mask shatters, and the engraved character takes over. If you are to survive and thrive in a world populated by complex, often deeply flawed individuals, you must cease evaluating people based on their charming surfaces, their impressive resumes, or their eloquent words. You must train yourself to see only the pattern. The pattern is the undeniable historical record of a person's actions. Every individual leaves a wake behind them. If you look closely at a person's past, you will see the same scenarios playing out with terrifying regularity. You will find the brilliant executive who always seems to clash with the board and resign in a cloud of bitter recrimination just as a project nears completion. You will encounter the alluring romantic partner who has a long, unbroken trail of fiery, short-lived relationships that all inexplicably end in dramatic betrayal. They will always present a convincing narrative wherein they are the unfortunate victim of circumstance or of other people's incompetence. Do not listen to the narrative. Look solely at the repetition. The pattern never lies. It is the purest manifestation of their character, and it is the absolute best predictor of what they will do to you. Recognizing this pattern requires you to become a relentless observer of character signs. Because character is deeply integrated into a person's entire being, it cannot be compartmentalized. It inevitably leaks out, often in the most mundane, seemingly insignificant moments of daily life. The great thinkers of antiquity understood that a single drop of water contains the precise chemical makeup of the entire ocean. Similarly, a single trivial action contains the essence of a person's entire character. Observe how a prospective partner or employee handles a minor inconvenience, like a delayed flight or a mistaken restaurant order. The individual whose character is weak will instantly fray, revealing a brittle inability to tolerate frustration. Watch how they treat those who offer them no immediate benefit, waitstaff, subordinates, or strangers. The person who is obsequious to the boss but cruel to the assistant is broadcasting a deep structural flaw that will eventually manifest in your relationship. Pay close attention to how they handle shared responsibilities. Do they quietly absorb more than their share of the work, or do they subtly maneuver to take the credit while deflecting the blame? These tiny gestures are the profound, unwritten language of human character. As you become literate in these signs, you must actively defend yourself by learning to identify and avoid specific toxic types.
These are individuals whose early psychological wounds have calcified into character structures that are actively dangerous to those around them. Consider the hyper-perfectionist. At first glance, they appear to be dedicated, visionary, and fiercely committed to quality. But as you draw closer, you realize their perfectionism is not about the work. It is a desperate, tyrannical need for control, rooted in a profound internal anxiety. They cannot delegate, they suffocate their subordinates with endless micromanagement, and they inevitably grind any collaborative effort to a paranoid, exhausted halt. Equally dangerous is the relentless rebel. They draw you in with their fierce independence, their bold iconoclasm, and their contempt for authority. They seem exciting and uniquely alive. Yet, if you attempt to build anything of lasting value with them, you will discover that their rebellion is merely a prolonged, unhealed adolescence. They are not fighting for a higher ideal, they are simply trapped in a compulsion to destroy whatever structure they are placed within, eventually turning their destructive gaze upon you. You must also beware the personalizer, the individual who perceives every neutral comment, every slight change in schedule, and every minor disagreement as a deliberate malicious attack on their ego. They demand constant emotional reassurance and will exhaust your psychic energy, forcing you to tiptoe through the minefield of their fragile self-esteem. Finally, there is the drama magnet. This type harbors a deep, unconscious terror of stability and peace. Whenever their life begins to settle into a comfortable rhythm, they will instinctively manufacture a crisis, pick a destructive fight, or make a reckless decision simply to feel the chaotic rush of adrenaline they mistake for vitality. To intertwine your life or your business with any of these toxic types is to voluntarily chain yourself to a sinking ship. You cannot fix them. You can only be dragged down by their undertow. The ultimate aim of this deep psychological observation is not merely to avoid the toxic, but to actively seek out and ally yourself with the superior character. A strong character is not defined by perfection, nor is it devoid of flaws or past mistakes. Rather, it is defined by a profound underlying resilience. The superior character possesses the internal strength to look at reality without flinching. When they face a setback, they do not collapse into victimhood or seek external scapegoats. They absorb the blow, adapt their strategy, and move forward. They are marked by a rare and vital trait, the ability to genuinely accept criticism. Because their self-worth is deeply rooted and secure, they do not view a critique of their work as an annihilation of their soul. They can process opposing viewpoints and integrate new information, making them highly adaptable in a rapidly changing world. Furthermore, the superior character is consistent. They do not operate in extreme, unpredictable oscillations of mood and commitment. When they give their word, it binds them. When they initiate a task, they possess the quiet, unglamorous fortitude to see it through the inevitable periods of boredom and frustration until it is finished. Your task is twofold. First, you must ruthlessly curate your inner circle, ensuring that you are surrounded by individuals of superior character who will elevate you, challenge you constructively, and remain steadfast when the inevitable storms of life arrive. Second, and most importantly, you must turn this piercing gaze inward. You must honestly examine your own patterns, your own compulsions, and your own character signs. True power in this world begins with the painful, necessary work of mitigating your own toxic tendencies and consciously cultivating the resilience, adaptability, and emotional fortitude of the superior character within yourself. Chapter 5. Become an elusive object of desire. We are creatures perpetually dissatisfied with our present reality. The moment we possess something we have deeply longed for, a subtle but profound psychological shift occurs. The object of our affection, once shimmering with the promise of absolute fulfillment, suddenly loses its luster in the cold light of everyday reality. We hold it in our hands, and the fantasy evaporates. This is the inescapable tragedy of human nature. Our desires are rarely sustained by reality. They are fueled almost entirely by imagination and absence. We are chronically wired to covet what lies just beyond our reach, to gaze across the fence at the supposedly greener pastures of our neighbors, and to invent flaws in the people and circumstances that surround us. The grass is forever greener on the other side. This perpetual restlessness, this endless craving for the unattainable, dictates the invisible currents of human interaction. If you make yourself too accessible, too easily understood, and too aggressively present, you inadvertently trigger a deep-seated contempt in those around you. You become a known quantity, a conquered territory, and the imagination of the other person immediately moves on to new, unconquered horizons. To wield true influence, you must fundamentally reverse this dynamic.
You must transform yourself from a mundane, predictable presence into a deeply alluring enigma. You must become the object of desire. This transformation does not require physical perfection or immense wealth. It is entirely a psychological maneuver. Consider the dynamic of the most captivating individuals in history. They never thrust themselves upon the world. Rather, they constructed a subtle vacuum that forced the world to chase them. They understood that the human imagination is a vast, empty canvas that demands to be filled. By revealing only fragments of their true thoughts, by maintaining an aura of self-contained independence, they invited others to project their deepest fantasies onto them. We see this play out in the realms of romance, business, and politics. The individual who appears slightly detached, who seems to harbor secret knowledge, and who does not desperately seek validation, instantly becomes a magnet for our attention. We want to possess them because they appear to be beyond possession. We covet their attention precisely because it is not freely given. They are the forbidden fruit, the locked room, the whispered secret. Achieving this powerful state requires the deliberate application of specific counterintuitive strategies. The most foundational of these is the mastery of absence. In a world obsessed with constant visibility and relentless communication, the simple act of withdrawing becomes a profound statement of power. When you step back, when you allow a silence to linger, you force the other person's imagination into overdrive. They begin to wonder what you're doing, who you are with, and why you are no longer hovering in their orbit.
This manufactured uncertainty is the breeding ground of covetousness. You must learn to ration your presence. Be intensely engaged when you are there, but depart just before the energy peaks, leaving them hungry for the next encounter. Equally vital is the strategy of triangulation. We are inherently mimetic creatures. Our desires are rarely autonomous. We want things simply because we see other people wanting them. You must cultivate an environment where you are perceived as highly valued by others. This does not mean vulgar bragging. It means allowing the subtle evidence of your popularity, your professional demand, or your romantic allure to organically reach the ears of your target. When they perceive that you are a prized commodity, their own desire for you is violently inflamed by the primal fear of missing out. You suddenly become a prize to be won in a silent competition. Furthermore, you must flirt with the boundaries of the forbidden. Human beings are inherently rebellious. We chafe against restrictions and moral absolutes. Objects, ideas, or individuals that carry a faint scent of danger, taboo, or unorthodoxy are magnetically attractive. By positioning yourself slightly outside the conventional norms, by holding opinions that challenge the status quo, or by possessing a past that hints at hidden depths, you tap into the universal human compulsion to touch the hot stove. You become the exhilarating exception to their predictable lives. Yet, if you remain trapped solely in the realm of manipulating interpersonal desire, you limit your own potential and risk becoming a hollow architect of illusions. The ultimate mastery of this law requires elevating your perspective toward the supreme desire. Base covetousness is rooted in ego and the desperate need to fill a psychological void with external validation, possessions, or conquests. It is a relentless, exhausting treadmill. The supreme desire, however, is the longing for connection to something vastly larger than oneself. It is the pursuit of mastery in a craft, the dedication to a profound truth, or the unyielding commitment to a transcendent cause. When you shift your internal focus from chasing the fleeting desires of others to pursuing a monumental life task, a remarkable paradox occurs. Your intense dedication to your work, your absolute immersion in your purpose, naturally renders you more elusive and detached from petty social dramas. You stop caring desperately about what others think because you are anchored to a heavier, more profound reality. And in doing so, you effortlessly radiate the exact qualities that trigger covetousness in others: independence, mystery, and an unshakable self-containment. By striving for the highest, most authentic version of your own destiny, you inadvertently become the ultimate object of desire, wielding a gravitational pull that is organic, enduring, and profoundly real. Chapter 6. Elevate your perspective. We are animals biologically wired to react to our immediate environment. For millions of years, human survival depended entirely on acute sensitivity to the present moment. A sudden rustle in the underbrush demanded instant flight. A sudden drop in temperature required an immediate search for shelter. This profound tethering to the present ensured our continuation as a species. However, in the complex, highly abstract architecture of the modern world, this ancient biological wiring has transformed into a crippling vulnerability. We are constantly seduced and terrorized by the immediate. We overreact to a critical email, a sudden dip in our finances, or a fleeting social conflict, treating these ephemeral events as if they were existential threats. We become hopelessly trapped in the immediate timeline, entirely incapable of seeing the long chain of consequences that stretch out before us. This psychological myopia locks us in a perpetual, exhausting cycle of reaction, blinding us to the larger, slower currents of time that actually shape our destinies. This temporal blindness reaches its most destructive zenith during moments of madness. Throughout history, entire societies have been repeatedly swept up in contagious, euphoric frenzies or terrified panics, completely untethered from rational, long-term calculation. Consider the catastrophic financial bubbles that periodically wipe out vast fortunes. When the intoxicating scent of effortless wealth permeates the culture, the collective mind aggressively narrows its focus exclusively to the immediate prospect of gain. The critical faculties, which ordinarily weigh risks and consult the sobering lessons of history, simply shut down. People enthusiastically leverage their life savings based on nothing but soaring charts and breathless rumors, utterly convinced that the present, manic trajectory will defy the laws of gravity forever. Yet, reality inevitably reasserts itself, and the subsequent crash leaves a desolate landscape of ruin. In our individual lives, these moments of madness occur whenever we succumb to intense immediate desires or sudden, overwhelming pressures. We lash out in a moment of bitter anger to win a trivial argument, permanently destroying a relationship that required decades to build. We impulsively pursue a shiny, immediate opportunity, carelessly abandoning a solid, long-term strategy. In the intense heat of the moment, the future simply ceases to exist. There is only the burning, undeniable necessity of the now. To escape this reactionary trap, we must learn to identify the subtle but pervasive signs of short-sightedness that creep into our daily behavior. The first profound symptom is the generation of unintended consequences. We encounter a complex problem, and driven by the agonizing urge to relieve the immediate pressure, we apply a hasty, superficial fix. We furiously swat at the symptom without taking the time to understand the underlying disease. Almost invariably, this quick fix sets off a hidden chain reaction of new, infinitely more complex problems. To conquer this tendency, we must train ourselves to pause, to physically and mentally step back and systematically map out the potential cascading effects of any significant action. We must cultivate the discipline to ask not just what will happen tomorrow, but what the landscape will look like a year or 5 years from now as a direct result of our choice. The second sign is becoming hopelessly entangled in tactical hell. In this frantic state, we are constantly engaged in daily skirmishes. We battle colleagues over minor turf disputes. We obsessively track daily metrics. We fight endless, exhausting fires. We feel incredibly busy and highly productive. Yet we are making absolutely no forward progress. We have fundamentally mistaken the battle for the war. The escape route requires a deliberate, forceful mental detachment. We must remove ourselves from the chaotic front lines and continually reaffirm our ultimate, overarching objective. If a conflict, a task, or a debate does not directly serve that grand strategy, it must be ruthlessly ignored, delegated, or abandoned. The third manifestation is ticker tape fever. In our hyper-connected age, we are relentlessly bombarded with an endless, roaring stream of real-time data, breaking news alerts, and social media updates. This constant influx of micro-information creates a dangerous illusion of profound knowledge, while simultaneously obliterating our perspective. We begin to react to every minor fluctuation in the market, every shift in public opinion, or every momentary scandal as if it were a definitive, permanent trend. To cure this fever, we must drastically reduce our consumption of immediate, unvetted information. We must cultivate a deep, philosophical skepticism of the breaking news mentality and instead intentionally seek out the slow, deep currents of history, long-term analysis, and enduring principles. The final sign of short-sightedness is getting lost in the trivia. When faced with a monumental task, a massive creative project, or a deeply complex decision, the sheer scale of the endeavor can trigger a paralyzing anxiety. To soothe this internal panic, we unconsciously retreat into the comforting, manageable realm of microscopic details. We spend weeks agonizing over the perfect font size in a presentation while the core argument remains unwritten. we endlessly debate the color of a logo while the product itself is fundamentally flawed. Overcoming this trap requires the brutal, unyielding discipline of prioritization. We must continually force our attention back to the massive structural pillars of our endeavor, refusing to allow our minds to hide in the comfortable weeds of the insignificant. The ultimate objective of this internal evolution is to become the far-sighted human. This is not a mystical clairvoyance, but a highly practical, rigorously cultivated discipline of the mind. The far-sighted individual operates with a profound, ever-present awareness of time. They do not view time as a hostile force rapidly slipping away, but as a vast, malleable canvas upon which they can patiently construct their greatest ambitions. When a crisis unexpectedly erupts, they do not join the panicked, reactionary scramble. They enforce a mental distance, allowing the immediate emotional storm to rage and pass without their participation. From this elevated vantage point, they calmly observe the broader landscape, identifying the true root causes of the turmoil and accurately anticipating how the situation will unfold over the long term. They can endure the agonizing boredom of slow, steady progress, and they can withstand the temporary misunderstanding of their peers, precisely because their eyes are fixed unblinkingly on a distant, magnificent summit. By mastering their relationship with time, by adamantly refusing to be bullied by the frantic, screaming demands of the present moment, they gain an almost godlike power over their own trajectory. They cease to be reactive prey in the chaotic jungle of daily events and transform into the calm, strategic architects of their own future. Chapter 7. Soften people's resistance by confirming their self-opinion. When Lyndon B. Johnson entered the United States Senate, he carried with him a singular, burning ambition to eventually reach the presidency. During his earlier years in the House of Representatives, his natural aggression and dominating style had yielded mixed results. The House was vast and chaotic, and Johnson's restless, demanding nature often alienated those around him. Upon arriving in the Senate, however, he experienced a profound revelation. He surveyed the chamber and realized it functioned not as a chaotic battleground, but as an intimate, fiercely guarded gentleman's club. If he attempted to bulldoze his way to the top of this hierarchy, the elder statesman would instantly unite to crush him. To conquer this unique environment, he realized he had to fundamentally alter his approach. He had to suppress his ego, mask his dominating nature, and master the subtle, invisible currents of the influence game. Johnson began by intentionally adopting a posture of extreme humility. He transformed himself into the quiet, diligent apprentice, actively seeking out the most powerful figures in the Senate, most notably the conservative titan Richard Russell. Johnson did not approach Russell with grand ideas or requests for power. Instead, he made himself incredibly useful, silently observing Russell's habits, mirroring his conservative values, and displaying a sudden, deep interest in Russell's personal passions, such as the Civil War and baseball. Johnson asked for advice, placing himself in a submissive role that made the elder senator feel exceptionally wise and respected. Without ever demanding a favor, Johnson anticipated Russell's needs and fulfilled them. Slowly, Russell began to view the young senator not as a threat, but as a loyal son and an extension of his own power. Once this unbreakable bond was forged, Johnson replicated the strategy across the political spectrum, targeting the ambitious liberal Hubert Humphrey. By tuning into Humphrey's unfulfilled need for validation and his dreams of higher office, Johnson provided the exact emotional resonance Humphrey craved, mirroring his adoration for Franklin D. Roosevelt. Step by step, by subjugating his own ego and allowing others to feel like the true masters of their fate, Johnson accumulated unprecedented leverage. Within 4 years, he bypassed decades of seniority to become the undisputed master of the Senate. He achieved ultimate power not by forcefully bending others to his will, but by recognizing that true influence is gained by focusing entirely outward, validating the deep-seated psychological needs of his targets. Johnson's ascent perfectly illustrates the fundamental law of defensiveness. From our earliest childhood experiences, we humans develop a self-protective shell. As we mature, the world proves to be a harsh, judgmental arena. We constantly feel that others are evaluating our competence or attempting to extract our time, money, and energy. To survive this relentless scrutiny, we erect thick internal walls, becoming increasingly defensive and self-absorbed. Yet we all secretly yearn to lay down our armor. We experience fleeting moments, perhaps in the euphoria of a passionate romance, the shared energy of a massive crowd, or a night of deep camaraderie, where these walls dissolve. In these rare states, we feel entirely accepted and secure. We feel fundamentally validated. When this occurs, our stubbornness evaporates and our minds open to new ideas and influences. The golden key to dissolving people's resistance lies in learning how to intentionally recreate this feeling of validation. To do this, one must understand that every individual operates under a deeply ingrained self-opinion. Regardless of objective reality, people hold a highly specific, idealized perception of their own character. This self-opinion generally rests on three universal pillars: the belief that they are completely autonomous and act of their own free will, the belief that they possess a unique and superior intelligence, and the belief that they are fundamentally good, decent people who support noble causes. Whenever you attempt to persuade someone by arguing, lecturing, or imposing your own brilliance, you inadvertently threaten these pillars. You imply that they are misinformed, misguided, or manipulated. In response, their psychological walls rise higher and their resistance becomes impenetrable. However, when you deliberately confirm their self-opinion, a magical transformation occurs. Their internal tension dissipates. Relieved of their insecurities, they relax, lower their defenses, and become incredibly susceptible to your direction. Becoming a master persuader requires the execution of 5 distinct strategies. The first is to transform yourself into a deep listener. In normal conversation, our attention is hopelessly divided. We hear only fragments of what is spoken because we are too busy formulating our next brilliant remark. You must forcefully silence this internal monologue. Approach the other person's mind as an undiscovered landscape. Pay acute attention to their nonverbal cues, guiding the conversation toward the subjects that make their eyes light up. When people feel that you are deeply absorbed in their words, they leave the interaction feeling wittier and more validated, and they naturally attach those positive feelings to your presence. The second strategy is to infect people with the proper mood. We are highly permeable, emotional creatures. If you approach an interaction with a rigid, judgmental attitude, the other person will instantly mirror your defensiveness. Instead, you must project a spirit of complete indulgence and warmth. Accept them entirely as they are, without moralizing or attempting to correct their flaws. This unconditional, almost maternal mildness has a hypnotic, disarming effect, melting away hostility before a single argument is even made. The third strategy requires you to actively confirm their specific self-opinion. To confirm their autonomy, you must never make them feel cornered or coerced. Instead, frame your requests as something they already desire, or as a rare opportunity they would be foolish to pass up. Just as the fictional Tom Sawyer convinced his friends that the tedious chore of whitewashing a fence was a supreme test of artistic skill, you must present your goals in a way that makes others volunteer their labor. To confirm their intelligence, learn the strategic value of allowing others to occasionally defeat you in trivial arguments. Seeking their advice and yielding to their logic flatters their ego, placing them in a slightly superior position that makes them highly vulnerable to a subsequent countermove. To confirm their goodness, always frame your mutual endeavors as noble causes, allowing them to feel virtuous while executing your plans. The fourth strategy involves identifying and allaying people's deepest insecurities. Everyone harbors secret doubts about their physical appeal, their professional competence, or their social standing. If you can accurately pinpoint these fragile areas and offer subtle, targeted reassurance, you will bind that person to you with chains of profound loyalty. Flattery works best when it is directed precisely at the qualities a person is most uncertain about. The fifth strategy is to harness the power of resistance itself, acting as a psychological judo master. When confronted with individuals who are exceptionally stubborn or rebellious, directly opposing them only fuels their rigidity. Instead, encourage their rebellion, agree with their contrarian stance, or gently suggest the exact opposite of what you actually desire, allowing them to assert their autonomy by rebelling against your suggestion and falling directly into your trap. Use their own defensive energy to propel them down the path of your choosing. To truly master this realm, however, you must turn the lens inward and develop a deeply flexible mind through specific self-strategies. It is the height of delusion to believe that you alone are immune to the law of defensiveness. You too cling to a rigid self-opinion. You too bristle at criticism and resist ideas that challenge your worldview. To wield true influence, you must consciously dismantle your own defensive architecture. Accept that your knowledge is limited and that your ego is far too easily bruised. Cultivate a fluid, adaptable intellect that can entertain opposing viewpoints without experiencing a sense of personal annihilation. By relinquishing your own desperate hunger for external validation, you free up the immense psychological energy required to focus entirely on others, forever altering the dynamic of human interaction and transforming yourself into an irresistible force of influence. Chapter 8. Change your circumstances by changing your attitude. We navigate our daily lives under the profound illusion that our circumstances are primarily shaped by external forces. We attribute our successes and our miseries to the fluctuations of the economy, the whims of our superiors, the privileges of our upbringing, or the unpredictable nature of luck. We view ourselves as vessels tossed upon a stormy sea, reacting as best we can to the waves that crash over us. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature and the mechanics of reality. The most potent, inescapable force determining your trajectory is not external. It is entirely internal. It is your attitude. Your attitude is not a passive reflection of your mood. It is an active, vital lens through which you perceive the world. This lens does not merely interpret reality, it actively constructs it. Every event, every interaction, and every challenge is filtered through this internal architecture before you even consciously register it. If your lens is clouded by fear, you will see threats multiplying in every shadow. If it is tinted with anger, you will invariably find reasons to be offended. You are constantly broadcasting your internal state to the world, and the world is simply reflecting that state back to you. This is the invisible mechanism of self-sabotage. We unconsciously author our own tragedies and then bitterly complain about the harshness of fate. Yet, within the terrifying realization of our own self-sabotage lies the ultimate freedom. If our attitude acts as the master architect of our reality, then by consciously dismantling and rebuilding that attitude, we possess the power to alter our circumstances from the inside out. We can look to the life of the great Russian playwright and physician Anton Chekhov for a masterful demonstration of this power. Chekhov was born into a reality designed to crush the human spirit. His grandfather had been a serf, and his father was a tyrannical, deeply embittered man who ran a failing grocery store and relentlessly beat his children over the slightest infractions. The Chekhov household was a prison of suffocating poverty, religious hypocrisy, and daily physical terror. In such a toxic environment, the natural, almost inevitable response is to adopt a deeply constricted attitude. Chekhov's older brothers did exactly this. They absorbed the hostility of their environment, developing attitudes of profound resentment and despair, eventually succumbing to alcoholism and ruin. They allowed the external world to permanently poison their internal lens. Anton Chekhov, however, orchestrated a radical internal rebellion. As a young man, he realized that while he lacked the physical power to defeat his father or the financial means to escape his circumstances, he possessed absolute sovereignty over his mind. He consciously chose to detach himself emotionally from the trauma. Instead of viewing his father through the blinding, destructive lens of hatred, he forced himself to look through a lens of clinical, scientific objectivity. He observed his father not as a monster, but as a deeply flawed specimen of humanity, a man whose own brutal upbringing in slavery had crippled his capacity for love. This monumental shift in perspective was Chekhov's ultimate freedom. By refusing to harbor resentment, he protected his vital energy. He did not waste his spirit fighting the unchangeable past. Instead, he channeled that preserved energy into his medical studies and his writing. With an expansive, objective attitude, he assumed responsibility for his entire family, paid off their debts, and transformed the agony of his youth into some of the most profound, empathetic literature in human history. He did not wait for his circumstances to improve so that he could feel better. He radically altered his internal state, and his external world had no choice but to follow suit. Most of humanity, unfortunately, operates under the heavy burden of a constricted attitude. This negative posture is generally forged in the fires of early childhood wounds or the accumulation of life's inevitable disappointments. The constricted mind views the world as an inherently hostile, competitive arena where resources are scarce, suffering is guaranteed, and other people are fundamentally untrustworthy. When you operate from this defensive crouch, you inadvertently set off a chain reaction of negative consequences. Consider the deeply suspicious individual who expects to be betrayed. Because they anticipate hostility, they approach new colleagues or romantic partners with a guarded, emotionally stingy demeanor. They constantly probe for hidden motives and withhold their own trust. This cold, interrogative behavior naturally makes the other person feel uncomfortable, judged, and eventually resentful. The other person withdraws or snaps back, perfectly fulfilling the initial paranoid prophecy. The suspicious individual then points to this withdrawal as absolute proof that people are treacherous, remaining entirely blind to their own role as the primary catalyst of the friction. This constricted nature manifests in several distinct toxic variations. There is the hostile attitude, which perceives every disagreement as a personal attack requiring a violent, aggressive response, ensuring a life of constant, exhausting warfare. There is the anxious attitude, which suffocates opportunity by obsessively magnifying every potential risk, paralyzing the individual and draining the confidence of anyone who works with them. There is the depressive attitude, which cloaks every endeavor in a heavy shroud of inevitable failure, draining the vitality from the room and ensuring that projects collapse under the weight of their own gloom. And there is the deeply resentful attitude, the silent poison that interprets the success of others as a personal insult, hoarding grudges and preventing any genuine collaborative joy. In every manifestation, the constricted attitude shrinks the world. It builds impenetrable walls, limits physical and mental horizons, and locks the individual in a repetitive self-sabotaging loop. The only escape from this psychological prison is the deliberate, lifelong cultivation of an expansive attitude. This is not to be confused with a naive, superficial optimism that stubbornly ignores the genuine tragedies and malevolence present in the world. An expansive attitude is a robust, courageous embrace of total reality. The expansive mind perceives the world not as a dark, threatening forest, but as a vast, endlessly fascinating laboratory. When confronted with severe adversity, the expansive individual refuses to retreat into the comforting, passive role of the victim. They do not exhaust their energy seeking external scapegoats or lamenting their bad luck. Instead, they view the obstacle as a necessary form of resistance training for the spirit. They ask not, "Why has this cruelty been inflicted upon me?" but rather, "What crucial lesson is hidden within this pain, and how can I extract it to forge a stronger version of myself?" To adopt this powerful stance, you must fundamentally alter how you view your fellow human beings. You must cease the exhausting habit of judging people against your own rigid, highly subjective moral framework. Instead, learn to view people as neutral, objective facts of nature, as complex and unalterable as the weather. They are driven by their own deeply rooted fears, their own childhood traumas, and their own desperate desires for validation. When you strip away your moralizing judgments, your anger is naturally replaced by a deep analytical empathy. You become profoundly curious about what makes them tick. This internal warmth is magnetic. Just as a hostile attitude provokes immediate defensiveness, an expansive, tolerant attitude naturally disarms those around you. People are powerfully drawn to the rare individual who makes them feel deeply seen and understood rather than constantly evaluated and found wanting. Furthermore, you must cultivate a sense of absolute boundlessness regarding your own potential. The limits you perceive in your life, your intelligence, your creativity, your capacity for endurance are largely illusions, self-imposed boundaries dictated by a fragile ego desperate to avoid the sting of failure. By embracing the expansive attitude, you accept that failure is not a permanent tattoo of your worthlessness, but merely necessary data in the ongoing process of mastery. You grant yourself the absolute permission to explore, to err, to shatter your old paradigms, and to constantly reinvent your understanding of what is possible. In doing so, you tap into the supreme generative power of human nature. You cease to be a passive victim of fate, reacting blindly to the circumstances you inherited, and you transform yourself into the active, conscious architect of your own destiny, bending the reality of your life to the immense, radiant gravity of your own mind. Chapter 9. Confront your dark side. People are rarely as they seem. Beneath the polite, cooperative, and pleasant exterior that almost everyone presents to the world, there lies a subterranean realm of repressed desires, deep-seated insecurities, and darker impulses. This hidden realm is governed by the law of repression. Throughout our lives, we are taught to conceal the less socially acceptable parts of our nature, our aggressive hunger for power, our selfish demands for attention, our petty jealousies, and our profound vulnerabilities. We lock these traits away, crafting a public persona that is acceptable, competent, and agreeable. Yet, the energy of these repressed emotions does not simply vanish. It accumulates in the dark, forming a second, hidden personality that operates largely outside of our conscious control. If we remain entirely blind to this internal division, we become slaves to it. When the pressure rises, this concealed force inevitably breaches the surface, leading to behavior that seems inexplicably destructive, irrational, or wildly out of character. To achieve true self-mastery, we must turn our gaze inward, recognizing this internal shadow, and learning to channel its immense, raw energy before it sabotages our lives. The tragic career of Richard Nixon serves as a monumental testament to the destructive power of a deeply repressed nature. His political ascent was built upon a meticulously crafted persona. He presented himself as a paragon of rational calculation, iron self-control, and unyielding toughness. He was the elder statesman who never let emotion cloud his judgment, the man who could navigate the treacherous waters of the Cold War without blinking. Yet behind closed doors, a drastically different reality played out. As the Watergate scandal began to slowly envelop his presidency, the immense pressure cracked his formidable facade. He became obsessed with petty revenge, spinning wild, paranoid fantasies about his perceived enemies. He vacillated endlessly over minor decisions and exhibited a terrifying ruthlessness. Ultimately, his downfall was secured by his own secret taping system in the White House. He recorded thousands of hours of unfiltered, dark conversations, fully aware the tapes existed, yet he could not bring himself to destroy them. It was as if he were mesmerized by this alternative version of himself, almost unconsciously ensuring his own exposure and punishment. To understand this phenomenon, we must look to his childhood. As an infant, Nixon was unusually needy, demanding constant attention and prone to tears. His parents, steeped in a harsh pioneer stoicism, offered little warmth and actively discouraged his vulnerability. He experienced profound feelings of abandonment. To survive, he buried that needy, terrified child deep within his psyche and forged a hardened armor. He became the ultimate fighter who claimed he never cried and never cared what others thought. But that wounded child never died. It simply retreated into the shadows. When the ultimate stress of the presidency bore down upon him, this shadow self violently re-emerged. The tragedy of Richard Nixon was not a lack of intelligence or political skill, but a catastrophic lack of self-awareness. He was entirely disconnected from his own dark side, and thus it destroyed him. This brings us to the fundamental reality of the dark side, a concept the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung termed the shadow. We are all born with a wild, intense, and multifaceted energy. As infants, we experience profound selfishness, aggression, and an insatiable desire to monopolize attention. We are capable of intense love, but also fierce hatred and manipulative tantrums when our needs are denied. However, as we grow, the demands of civilization and the desperate need for our parents' approval force us to tame this energy. We quickly learn that to be loved and to fit into the social group, we must be polite, cooperative, and selfless. We internalize the moral codes of our culture and aggressively push our darker, wilder impulses down into the unconscious. Yet this repression requires an immense expenditure of psychic energy. The shadow is not a passive entity. It is alive and constantly seeking release. The thicker the repression, the harder we try to appear perfectly saintly or relentlessly tough, the more volatile the shadow becomes. It leaks out in our dreams, in sudden, inexplicable bouts of depression or anxiety, in the cruel jokes we make, or in the mistakes we unconsciously orchestrate. It emerges when we are fatigued, stressed, or intoxicated. It also manifests in the phenomenon of projection. Unable to accept our own repressed desires for power, dominance, or sexual transgression, we project these exact qualities onto others. We see enemies everywhere who are supposedly trying to dominate us, allowing us to righteously attack them and vent our own aggressive energy under the guise of self-defense or moral outrage. If we are to navigate the social world safely, we must become supreme decoders of the shadow, learning the art of deciphering contradictory behavior. When people present an image that is overly emphatic when they push a single, idealized trait to an extreme, you must train yourself to look for the exact opposite trait buried just beneath the surface. The emphatic trait is merely a distraction, a brilliant performance designed to conceal the very thing they are most terrified of revealing. Consider the tough guy. He swaggers, boasts of his physical exploits or his ruthless business conquests, and projects an aura of absolute invulnerability. But beneath this hypermasculine bluster lies a deeply frightened, overly sensitive core. The toughness is a shell constructed to protect a profound vulnerability. If you challenge his ego, the mask cracks, revealing a brittle, almost childish touchiness. Similarly, beware of the saint. These individuals project an aura of absolute purity and moral superiority, dedicating themselves to the noblest causes. Yet this relentless performance of goodness often masks a ferocious, unacknowledged hunger for power, attention, or sensual gratification. When given authority, their repressed authoritarian nature inevitably leaks out, often leading them to tyrannize their followers or engage in the very forbidden behaviors they publicly condemn. Then there is the passive-aggressive charmer. Initially, they overwhelm you with their niceness, accommodation, and apparent selflessness. They weave their way into your life through sheer affability. But this extreme deference conceals a seething, repressed aggression and envy. Because they are terrified of direct conflict, they will inevitably lash out through secret sabotage, subtle gossip, or sudden, inexplicable betrayals, leaving you confused and wounded. You must also be watchful for the fanatic, the individual whose absolute, unyielding conviction in a cause or an idea seems almost superhuman. This rigid certainty is almost always a desperate compensation for a profound, terrifying inner emptiness and a paralyzing inability to tolerate ambiguity. At the crucial moment of action, their underlying indecision and doubt will often rise up and sabotage their own efforts. Finally, you will encounter the easy moralizer, the person who expresses constant outrage at the flaws and supposed sins of others. They view the world in stark black and white, incapable of tolerating the nuanced realities of human nature. This compulsive moralizing is a release valve for their own profound self-loathing and their secret envious attraction to the very pleasures and transgressions they so loudly denounce. In all of these cases, the rule remains absolute. The more aggressive the front, the deeper and darker the shadow it conceals. The ultimate goal of this psychological excavation is not merely to defend against the destructive tendencies of others, but to forge yourself into the integrated human. To achieve this, you must radically shift your relationship with your own dark side. You must cease viewing your repressed impulses as shameful demons to be locked away. Instead, recognize that the shadow contains a vast reservoir of raw, authentic energy. When you acknowledge your own capacity for selfishness, aggression, and the desire for power, you strip these impulses of their secret, destructive control over you. Integration is the process of bringing this subterranean energy into the light of consciousness and channeling it purposefully. Your underlying aggression, once acknowledged, can be transformed into the relentless drive necessary to conquer difficult obstacles or advocate fiercely for a worthy cause. Your deep-seated vulnerabilities and childhood wounds, instead of being hidden behind a mask of false toughness, can become the wellspring of profound empathy, allowing you to connect with the suffering of others on a visceral level. By accepting the entirety of your nature, including your most unpalatable flaws, you cease performing a draining one-dimensional role. You become a fully realized, three-dimensional being. This complete acceptance of your true character radiates an undeniable authenticity that others find magnetically attractive. You are no longer at war with yourself, but rather drawing upon the full spectrum of your human potential, wielding the totality of your nature with conscious, masterful intent. Chapter 10. Beware the fragile ego. We live in a world defined by continuous social comparison. From the moment we first interact with peers, our minds are unconsciously calculating our relative status. We measure our wealth, our intelligence, our attractiveness, and our success against those around us. This relentless measuring is an ancient hardwired survival mechanism. When we perceive that we are falling behind, that a peer has acquired something we desire, we experience a profound physical pang of inferiority. Our ego, which requires a constant sense of validation and superiority to remain stable, feels instantly threatened. This pain is the genesis of the most hidden and destructive emotion in the human repertoire: envy. The law of envy dictates that we cannot long tolerate the presence of someone who makes us feel lesser. However, because admitting to envy is an admission of our own inferiority, it is entirely unacceptable to our conscious minds. We cannot say, "I am envious." Instead, we repress the emotion and transmute it. We construct a narrative in which the successful person is somehow flawed, overly ambitious, or simply the beneficiary of blind luck. We disguise our envy as righteous indignation or moral superiority, allowing us to tear down the envied person while keeping our own fragile ego intact. The most dangerous manifestation of this emotion rarely comes from our declared enemies. It emerges from those closest to us, taking the form of fatal friends. Consider the tragedy of the brilliant writer Mary Shelley and her supposed confidant Jane Williams. Following the tragic drowning of Mary's husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary leaned heavily on Jane, who had also lost her partner in the same accident. Jane appeared endlessly sympathetic, drawing Mary into a tight, sisterly bond, yet beneath Jane's comforting facade lay a deep, festering envy of Mary's literary genius, her fame, and the profound love she had shared with Percy. Unable to create anything of lasting value herself, Jane used her intimate proximity to slowly, systematically destroy Mary's reputation. She whispered malicious rumors through London society, claiming Mary had made Percy miserable and driven him to despair. Because Jane was a close friend, the rumors carried the devastating weight of authority. This is the insidious paradox of the envier. They are often drawn to befriend the very person who triggers their inferiority. Proximity allows the envier to disguise their painful feelings as affection while gaining a front-row seat to the envied person's life. From this vantage point, they can discover the target's deepest vulnerabilities and execute their sabotage with surgical precision. When the attack finally comes, the victim is left profoundly confused and doubly wounded by the betrayal. To protect yourself from this quiet poison, you must become a supreme decoder of the subtle, involuntary signs of envy. The human face cannot perfectly conceal the immediate, visceral pain of another's success. When you share a piece of wonderful news, a promotion, a lucrative contract, a new romance, watch the other person's eyes before they have time to arrange their features. You will often catch a micro-expression of disappointment, a fleeting dullness in the eyes, a sudden tenseness in the jaw, lasting only a fraction of a second before a strained, artificial smile is hastily pasted on. Conversely, if you share a moment of misfortune or failure, you may detect the unmistakable momentary gleam of schadenfreude, a secret joy at your pain. Beyond facial cues, listen carefully for poisonous praise. This occurs when an envier offers a compliment that secretly contains a barb designed to unsettle you. They might praise the sheer volume of money your new venture will make, subtly implying that your work lacks artistic or moral value. They might loudly lament the loss of something you once had, seeming compassionate while actively reopening your emotional wounds. These little envy bites are designed to inject self-doubt precisely at the moment of your triumph. As you navigate the social landscape, you must learn to identify the specific envier types who roam our workplaces and social circles. Beware the leveler, a personality who employs cynical humor to deflate anyone who displays excellence or ambition. Driven by a profoundly fragile ego, the leveler cannot tolerate the existence of greatness because it highlights their own mediocrity. They reframe success as an inherent injustice, seeking to drag everyone down to their own stagnant altitude. Similarly destructive is the self-entitled slacker, an individual who believes they deserve the world's attention and rewards simply for existing. When they encounter someone who has achieved success through grueling effort and sacrifice, they do not feel inspired, they feel robbed. They resent the achiever for possessing what they believe should rightfully be theirs without the exertion. You must also guard against the attacher. This type suffers from a profound internal emptiness and a lack of personal purpose. They inevitably gravitate toward individuals who radiate drive and vision, flattering their way into the achiever's inner circle. Their goal is not to contribute, but to siphon off the achiever's energy and eventually sabotage their work, punishing the achiever for having the very purpose the attacher lacks. Finally, in the professional realm, you must be extremely cautious of the insecure master. This is a boss or superior whose high position only magnifies their hidden self-doubts. When a talented, energetic subordinate begins to shine, the insecure master does not view them as an asset, but as an existential threat. They will quietly demote, marginalize, or fire the rising star, offering a manufactured excuse about the subordinate not being a team player, all to protect their own precarious sense of superiority. Understanding these types is critical, but you must also be acutely aware of the specific circumstances that act as envy triggers. The most volatile trigger is a sudden dramatic shift in your status, wealth, or public recognition, particularly among your professional peers. As the ancient proverb notes, the potter envies the potter and the writer envies the writer. When you suddenly ascend, you inadvertently cast a harsh shadow on those who remain struggling in the same arena. Your success forces them to confront their own lack of progress. In such moments of sudden elevation, you must actively attempt to diffuse the inevitable envy. Downplay your brilliance, attribute a portion of your success to sheer luck, and maintain a self-deprecating humor. Never flaunt your new status, for doing so is akin to waving a red cape before a wounded bull. Ultimately, the goal of this psychological mastery is not simply to defend against the malice of others, but to evolve beyond envy yourself. It is a delusion to believe you are entirely immune to this primal comparing mechanism. When you feel that inevitable sickening pang upon witnessing someone else's triumph, you must not repress it or disguise it as righteous anger. Instead, bring it into the light of consciousness. Begin by moving closer to what you envy. From a distance, success appears flawless and glittering, but if you draw near and examine the lives of the rich and famous, you will invariably discover profound miseries, suffocating pressures, and deeply flawed personal relationships. The illusion of perfection evaporates, and the envy dissipates with it. Furthermore, you must actively practice downward comparisons. Instead of agonizing over those who possess more, look clearly at the multitudes who possess far less, who face harrowing adversity and insecurity. This practice cultivates deep, grounding gratitude, which is the ultimate antidote to the poison of envy. You must also strive to cultivate the rare and noble capacity to genuinely rejoice in the joy of others. When a colleague succeeds, force yourself to empathetically experience their satisfaction, rather than surrendering to the pang of your own lack. Finally, you must transmute your envious energy into emulation. You cannot stop your brain from comparing, but you can alter the result. When you see a master at work, do not allow your ego to drag you into resentment. Instead, let their excellence serve as a supreme standard. Let the painful awareness of your own shortcomings become the fuel for your own relentless effort. By transforming your secret desire to tear others down into the burning ambition to elevate yourself, you conquer the most insidious of all human emotions and forge a character of unassailable strength. Chapter 11. Know your limits. We are deeply susceptible to a profound distortion of reality whenever we experience a significant triumph or an elevation in our social standing. In the arduous climb toward our goals, we are naturally forced to be hyper-aware of our surroundings, to keenly assess the talents of our collaborators, and to maintain a healthy respect for the unpredictable nature of fate. But the moment we achieve a monumental victory, a dangerous psychological alchemy occurs. The intoxicating surge of positive reinforcement floods our neurological pathways, acting as a potent narcotic. We begin to look back at the path of our success and systematically erase the crucial contributions of timing, the support of mentors, and the immense role of sheer luck. We rewrite the history of our achievement to center entirely upon our own innate brilliance and unyielding willpower. This is the inescapable gravitational pull of grandiosity. It is a fundamental human trait, an exaggeration of our necessary survival ego, mutating into a sprawling, insatiable entity that demands ever-increasing validation. As this internal narrative takes hold, we plunge headlong into a state of profound delusion regarding our own capabilities. We become convinced that whatever we touch will inevitably turn to gold. Because we attribute our past victories solely to our superior intellect, we assume that this intellect can effortlessly map onto any new endeavor, regardless of our actual experience or training. We abandon the meticulous, grinding work that originally brought us success, replacing it with bold, sweeping strokes and increasingly reckless gambles. In this feverish state, our relationship with other people drastically deteriorates. We stop actively listening. We perceive the cautious advice or constructive criticism of our peers not as vital reality checks, but as the irritating noise of inferior, fearful minds. We begin to view the people around us merely as instruments to be utilized in the ongoing expansion of our own magnificent story. Our empathy evaporates, replaced by a suffocating, self-referential bubble that blinds us to the shifting, complex realities of the world outside our own minds. This destructive trajectory reaches its terrifying zenith when an individual possessing this delusion acquires formal power. The history of business and politics is littered with the wreckage left behind by grandiose leaders. Often, these figures initially ascend through a potent combination of undeniable charisma and the stabilizing presence of pragmatic, grounded partners. Yet, once the summit is reached, the grandiose leader instinctively marginalizes or outright banishes those very partners who provided their essential anchor to reality. Surrounded entirely by sycophants who merely echo their own inflated self-opinion, the leader's decision-making becomes utterly untethered. They launch disastrous, overextended campaigns, whether military invasions, reckless corporate acquisitions, or draconian social policies, driven entirely by a desperate compulsion to continuously validate their mythic self-image. When these massive, ill-conceived projects inevitably begin to fracture, the grandiose leader is psychologically incapable of absorbing the blame. They become deeply paranoid, ruthlessly searching for internal traitors and external saboteurs, perfectly willing to destroy the entire institution rather than confront the agonizing reality of their own fundamental limitations. However, the immense driving energy that fuels our grandiosity is not inherently toxic. The disaster lies only in its profound disconnection from reality. To truly harness the full potential of human ambition, we must consciously cultivate a state of grounded, practical expansion. We must retain the fierce desire to achieve the extraordinary and to push beyond accepted boundaries, but we must strictly tether those desires to the undeniable facts of our existence. This requires a ruthless, unflinching self-assessment. We must know precisely where our competence ends. When we venture into new territory, we must consciously adopt the humility of the absolute beginner, rather than assuming our past glories grant us automatic mastery. We must focus our expansive energy not on seeking universal adoration or limitless power, but on the relentless, focused pursuit of excellence within a specific, tangible craft. By anchoring our highest aspirations to a daily, grueling commitment to the work itself, and by maintaining a profound, abiding respect for the vast complexities of the world that lie entirely outside our control, we transform the destructive fire of the ego into an unyielding, sustainable force for genuine achievement. Chapter 12. Reconnect to the masculine or feminine within you. We are born into this world entirely whole, possessing a vast, fluid spectrum of human potential. In our earliest years, as young boys and girls, we naturally display a rich blend of traits that society later sharply divides into the masculine and the feminine. A young boy can be deeply sensitive, profoundly empathetic, and prone to tears, just as a young girl can be fiercely aggressive, domineering, and physically reckless. Biologically and psychologically, we carry the genetic and mental imprints of both our mother and our father. However, as we step out of the protective sphere of early childhood and enter the highly structured social world, a severe, invisible pressure descends upon us. We are relentlessly instructed on the proper ways to behave, speak, and feel according to our biological sex. To avoid social ostracization and to secure the approval of our peers and parents, we undergo a profound psychological splitting. We actively cultivate the traits associated with our assigned gender, and we ruthlessly repress the characteristics that belong to the opposite. This forced division is the mechanism behind the law of gender rigidity. For men, this often means burying their innate sensitivity, their capacity for vulnerability, and their intuitive emotional understanding beneath a hardened shell of stoicism, hypercompetitiveness, and absolute logical control. For women, it frequently demands the suppression of their aggressive ambition, their blunt assertiveness, and their desire for raw power, replacing these with an enforced posture of extreme accommodation, submissiveness, and relentless emotional caretaking. Yet these repressed qualities do not vanish. They are merely driven into the dark recesses of the unconscious, forming what the psychologist Carl Jung termed the anima in men and the animus in women. Because this hidden half contains vital, unexpressed psychic energy, its repression leaves us feeling fundamentally incomplete. We become rigid, predictable, and one-dimensional in our responses. When life demands that a man utilize profound empathy to resolve a delicate conflict, he finds himself paralyzed, possessing only the blunt instrument of logic. When a situation requires a woman to fiercely defend her boundaries or seize a ruthless advantage, she hesitates, trapped by the compulsion to remain pleasant. To break free from this suffocating restriction, we must embark on the arduous journey of recovering our lost half, thereby discovering our authentic gender. This is not about erasing the genuine biological and psychological differences between the sexes, but rather about expanding our behavioral repertoire to include the entirety of our innate potential. We can find a breathtaking example of this integrated power in the life of the Renaissance noblewoman Caterina Sforza. Born into the brutal, hyper-masculine world of 15th century Italian politics, Caterina initially mastered the traditional feminine arts of her era. She was renowned for her grace, her elegance, and her deep knowledge of herbal remedies and cosmetics. Yet beneath this socially acceptable exterior, she secretly nurtured the fierce, martial spirit of her warlord ancestors. When her husband was assassinated and her family's power was violently threatened, Caterina did not retreat into the expected feminine role of weeping submission or passive victimhood. Instead, she unleashed her repressed masculine energy. She personally took command of the fortress of Ravaldino, donning armor and directing the military defense with a ruthless, terrifying aggression that stunned her enemies. She utilized her feminine charm to initially disarm her opponents
and then struck with a shockingly masculine brutality when they lowered their guard. By seamlessly integrating the soft, diplomatic graces of the feminine with the hard, uncompromising violence of the masculine, she became a profoundly unpredictable and formidable force, ruling her territories with a mastery that terrified and fascinated the most powerful men in Europe. When we fail to achieve this internal integration, the repressed energy of our lost half violently distorts our perception of the world, leading to profound misery in our relationships through the mechanism of gender projection. Because we feel an agonizing emptiness within, we unconsciously seek to fill that void by searching for our missing traits in a romantic partner. A man who has ruthlessly severed his connection to his own emotional depths will often find himself magnetically drawn to a hyper-feminine woman who displays extreme emotional volatility and dependence. He projects his own suppressed anima onto her, believing she possesses the magical emotional key to his salvation. Conversely, a woman who has buried her own ambition and assertiveness will project her animus onto a hyper-masculine, domineering man, unconsciously hoping he will provide the strength and agency she refuses to claim for herself. These relationships are inevitably doomed to a tragic cycle of disappointment. The infatuation is based not on genuine love for the actual human being, but on a desperate, narcissistic fascination with an internalized fantasy, as the reality of the partner's actual flaws and complex humanity inevitably pierces the illusion. The projector reacts with bitter resentment, punishing their partner for failing to live up to the impossible standards of the fantasy. This projection also manifests in the tragic archetypes of the rigidly gendered. The hyper-masculine man, constantly boasting of his conquests and his invulnerability, is actually driven by a profound, repressed terror of the feminine, often resulting in a deep, unacknowledged emotional dependence on the very women he seeks to dominate. The hyper-feminine woman, presenting a facade of absolute helplessness and childlike innocence, often wields this assumed weakness as a tyrannical weapon, manipulating those around her through guilt and covert emotional blackmail. Both types are prisoners of their own rigidly enforced performances, exhausted by the constant effort required to maintain a one-dimensional mask. The ultimate aim of our psychological development must be to transcend these exhausting performances and forge ourselves into the original man or woman. This requires the brave, conscious excavation of our repressed qualities. A man must learn to embrace the fluid, intuitive, and nurturing aspects of his psyche. He must recognize that genuine vulnerability is not a fatal weakness, but the very foundation of profound courage and authentic connection. By allowing his sensitivity to temper his aggression, his actions become not merely forceful, but deeply resonant and humane. A woman must consciously reclaim her right to raw ambition, unapologetic assertiveness, and cool, objective logic. She must dismantle the internalized belief that her worth is entirely dependent on her constant accommodation of others. When she fuses her natural capacity for deep empathy with an unyielding, fierce independence, she acquires a commanding presence that cannot be ignored or marginalized. The original man or woman possesses a mesmerizing, almost magical aura. They are endlessly fascinating precisely because they defy simple categorization. They can be incredibly tough when the situation demands it, yet profoundly tender a moment later. They can analyze a problem with cold, surgical precision and then solve it using a burst of pure, irrational intuition. They do not operate from a defensive crouch of societal expectation, but from a deep, integrated center of total self-acceptance. By reuniting the fractured halves of their own soul, they tap into the supreme creative energy of human nature, achieving a level of mastery, influence, and profound internal peace that the rigidly divided can never comprehend. Chapter 13. Advance with a sense of purpose. We are unique among all living creatures in our agonizing awareness of time. We know that our lives are finite, and this underlying consciousness creates a profound, persistent psychological tension. Unlike animals, whose lives are entirely dictated by instinct and the immediate demands of survival, human beings are unmoored. We possess an overwhelming amount of freedom to choose our actions, our careers, and our allegiances. Yet this vast freedom is often the source of our deepest miseries. Without a clear internal compass, we fall victim to the law of aimlessness. We drift through our days, reacting blindly to whatever immediate stimulus crosses our path. We chase the fleeting approval of our peers. We pursue financial rewards that ultimately leave us feeling hollow, and we constantly shift our interests based on the latest cultural trends. This aimless existence is mentally exhausting. It requires us to constantly reinvent our motivations, leaving us highly susceptible to anxiety, depression, and a lingering, quiet despair.
We feel that our days are slipping through our fingers like dry sand, amounting to nothing of lasting substance. To escape this terrifying drift, we must recognize that true fulfillment does not arrive by chance, nor is it handed down by an external authority. It must be consciously, meticulously forged from within. The journey begins with the excavation of what can be called the voice. Every human being is born with a totally unique genetic makeup and a distinct neurological architecture. In our earliest years, before the crushing weight of societal expectation descends upon us, this uniqueness naturally expresses itself. We are inexplicably drawn to specific activities, perhaps a fascination with the structural mechanics of a bridge, a deep resonance with musical patterns, a magnetic attraction to the written word, or an innate desire to organize and lead our playmates. In these moments of pure, unself-conscious engagement, we experience a feeling of rightness, a silent internal voice guiding us toward our natural domain. However, as we mature, a tragedy of human development inevitably occurs. We become acutely aware of the judgments of others. The voices of our parents, our teachers, and our peers begin to echo in our minds, dictating what is considered a practical career, what behaviors are socially acceptable, and what forms of success are truly valuable. Slowly, the deafening roar of these external expectations drowns out our quiet internal voice. We abandon our primal inclinations to pursue the paths that promise security and approval. We become alienated from our deepest selves. The first and most critical task in achieving self-mastery is to deliberately quiet the external noise and reawaken that buried voice. We must look backward, analyzing the moments in our past when we felt most intensely alive and deeply engaged in a task, regardless of its financial or social reward. By identifying these enduring passions, we begin to map the contours of our true calling. Once this internal compass is rediscovered, we cannot rely on mere inspiration to carry us forward. We must actively construct a robust framework to sustain our momentum, employing specific strategies for developing a high sense of purpose. The foundational strategy is the creation of a ladder of descending goals. A grand, overarching life task can often feel paralyzing in its immensity. To prevent this overwhelming anxiety, we must break our ultimate vision down into a series of highly specific, immediate objectives. We focus our energy entirely on mastering the skill directly in front of us, conquering the project at hand, and achieving the milestone scheduled for tomorrow. By keeping our daily gaze fixed on the immediate rung of the ladder, we maintain a constant sense of forward progression, building the quiet, unbreakable confidence required to eventually reach the summit. Simultaneously, we must learn to transform resistance into fuel. The pursuit of a genuinely authentic path will inevitably invite opposition. Friends may misunderstand our choices, competitors will attempt to undermine our efforts, and the world will present a seemingly endless series of frustrating obstacles. Those without a deeply rooted purpose will interpret this resistance as a sign to surrender, but the individual armed with a high sense of purpose uses this negativity as a vitalizing spur. The doubt of others sharpens their resolve, the obstacles demand greater creativity and resilience. Furthermore, we must actively curate our environment, surrounding ourselves with individuals who radiate their own high purpose. The energy of deep commitment is highly contagious. By immersing ourselves in a community of driven, focused minds, we naturally elevate our own standards and absorb the necessary stamina to endure the inevitable periods of fatigue and doubt. Yet as we strive for this elevated state, we must remain fiercely vigilant against the lure of false purposes. The human need for meaning is so desperate and so absolute that when we fail to cultivate an authentic internal purpose, we will frantically grab at whatever ready-made substitutes the culture offers. We see this desperate hunger in the individual who entirely subsumes their identity into a massive corporation, mistaking a job title for a soul. We witness it in those who become completely hypnotized by the pursuit of wealth, convinced that the accumulation of capital will eventually fill the profound emptiness echoing within them. We observe it in the terrifying allure of extreme political ideologies or religious cults, which offer a seductive, instant sense of belonging and a clear, simplistic narrative of good and evil. These false purposes are incredibly dangerous precisely because they provide a temporary, intoxicating high. They relieve the painful burden of individual choice. For a time, the follower feels energized, righteous, and connected. However, these structures are fundamentally external and fragile. When the charismatic leader falls, when the corporation downsizes, or when the sheer accumulation of money loses its novelty, the false purpose collapses, leaving the individual infinitely more shattered and lost than before. True purpose cannot be borrowed bought or downloaded from a collective movement. It must be a living, organic extension of your most authentic nature. It is a quiet, unyielding fire that burns entirely self-sustained. When you are anchored to this deeply personal life task, you possess an internal sanctuary that no external force can violate. The inevitable criticisms of the crowd lose their sting, the allure of superficial distractions evaporates, and the agonizing dread of wasted time is replaced by a fierce, joyful immersion in the work of becoming exactly who you were always meant to be. Chapter 14. Resist the downward pull of the group. We walk through our lives fiercely clinging to the myth of our own rugged individualism. We proudly believe that our political convictions, our aesthetic tastes, and our moral frameworks are the exclusive products of our own rigorous, solitary reasoning. We imagine that our minds are impregnable fortresses, entirely immune to the subtle influences of the people around us. Yet this illusion of profound independence shatters the very moment we step into a crowd, join a professional organization, or align ourselves with a social movement. A sudden, invisible gravity takes hold. The moment we become part of a collective, a silent but overwhelming psychological shift occurs, binding us to the law of conformity. We are, at our core, deeply social animals burdened with a primal terror of isolation. For our ancient ancestors, to be cast out from the tribe meant certain death. This ancestral fear remains hardwired into our nervous systems. Consequently, when we are immersed in a group, our individual critical faculties undergo a rapid, unconscious surrender. We stop evaluating reality through our own independent lens and begin desperately scanning the group for cues on how to feel, what to believe, and who to hate. We mirror the emotions of our peers, we adopt the collective outrage, and we slowly, voluntarily lower our intellectual standards to match the lowest common denominator of the crowd. To witness the sheer, terrifying speed of this metamorphosis, one need only look at history as a massive, horrifying laboratory, observing an experiment in human nature on a grand scale. Consider the cultural revolutions and mass hysterical movements that periodically sweep across nations. In these moments of collective fever, ordinary, decent individuals, students, teachers, neighbors, are suddenly transformed into rabid zealots. The transformation does not begin with a conscious decision to commit atrocities. It begins with the intoxicating thrill of belonging. In the initial stages of a mass movement, the group generates a euphoric, electric energy. The heavy burden of individual responsibility is magically lifted. You no longer have to struggle with complex moral ambiguities. The group provides a stark, absolute binary of good and evil, of absolute righteousness and absolute corruption. As this contagion spreads, the group mind reveals its fundamentally regressive nature. It is incapable of nuance. It demands absolute purity and violently rejects any dissenting voice. Even the most intelligent individuals within the group find themselves caught in the undertow. They feel the subtle, chilling threat that if they do not echo the escalating radicalism of their peers, they will be branded as traitors and cast out into the cold. And so they conform, they silence their internal doubts, they nod in agreement with increasingly absurd dogma, and they eventually participate in acts of cruelty they would have found utterly abhorrent in their solitary lives. They become infected by the viral emotion of the mob, proving that human rationality is a delicate, fragile construct that easily dissolves in the potent acid of group dynamics. This dangerous conformity is not limited to the dramatic, bloody revolutions of history. It is the fundamental, operating principle of our daily lives. Whenever humans gather in a structured environment, whether a corporate office, a political campaign, or a tightly knit social circle, they inevitably recreate the claustrophobic, treacherous dynamics of the court and its courtiers. In the royal courts of the past, the absolute monarch held the power of life and death, forcing every nobleman to become a master of deceit, flattery, and subtle manipulation just to survive. Today, the modern workplace functions on the exact same psychological architecture. There is always a sovereign, the CEO, the manager, the informal social leader, who dictates the prevailing mood and values of the group. To navigate this modern court, individuals instinctively adopt the survival strategies of the courtier. We learn to carefully mask our true opinions, offering instead the polished, agreeable sentiments that the group demands. We study the unwritten rules of the corporate culture, the acceptable ways to dress, the specific jargon to employ, and the unspoken taboos that must never be violated. We smile at the sovereign's weak jokes, we fiercely defend the group's petty fiefdoms, and we engage in the endless, exhausting theater of office politics. If you stubbornly refuse to play this game, if you insist on brutal honesty, or if you refuse to adopt the group's specific anxieties, you will be perceived as arrogant and dangerous. The group will subtly close ranks against you, starving you of resources, excluding you from the vital flow of information, and ultimately neutralizing you as a threat to their collective cohesion. Yet to completely surrender your soul to the court is a psychological death. If you desperately seek your entire self-worth in the approval of the group, you will lose your creative spark, your daring, and your inner compass. The masterful individual must learn to play the courtier flawlessly on the outside, offering the necessary social lubrications and respecting the group's fragile ego while maintaining a fortress of absolute detached independence on the inside. While the political machinations of the court are an inevitable feature of human existence, we are not forever doomed to operate in this suffocating dysfunction. When circumstances demand that we forge a team to accomplish a monumental task, we possess the power to consciously engineer a radically different environment. The reality group. Unlike the traditional court, which is bound together by emotional contagion, shared grievances, and an obsessive focus on internal hierarchy, the reality group is forged in the fires of objective execution. It is a collective entity completely oriented toward the outside world, bound by a relentless, unyielding focus on the work itself. The foundation of a reality group is its profound connection to a transcendent purpose. The leader of such a group does not maintain control through petty manipulation, emotional outbursts, or the fostering of internal rivalries. Instead, they lead by embodying the highest standards of excellence and by constantly clarifying the ultimate mission. In a reality group, the suffocating demand for absolute ideological conformity is discarded. Diverse opinions, radical ideas, and constructive friction are actively encouraged precisely because they are necessary for solving complex problems. However, this freedom of thought is firmly anchored to the bedrock of reality. Ideas are brutally tested against actual results. If a strategy fails, there is no scrambling to protect fragile egos, no witch hunts for internal scapegoats, and no retreating into comforting delusions. The failure is analyzed with cold clinical precision, the necessary lessons are extracted, and the group adapts. By demanding absolute accountability and prioritizing the harsh truths of reality over the soothing fictions of groupthink, the reality group becomes a highly adaptive, fiercely effective organism. It is the ultimate antidote to the downward pull of human nature, allowing the individuals within it to retain their unique brilliance while combining their energies to achieve a mastery that none could ever attain alone. Chapter 15. Make them want to follow you. When you assume a position of leadership, you step into a treacherous and deeply paradoxical psychological arena. You might assume that because people have elected you, hired you, or willingly joined your enterprise, they genuinely want you to succeed. You believe that if you act with fairness and competence, they will offer their steadfast loyalty. This is a dangerous, naive illusion that fundamentally ignores the law of fickleness. The human animal is profoundly ambivalent toward authority. We harbor a deeply ingrained, almost childlike desire for a strong, capable figure to guide us, to shoulder the terrifying burden of ultimate responsibility, and to provide a cohesive vision for the future. Yet simultaneously, we fiercely resent being told what to do. We chafe under the restrictions imposed by others, and our egos inevitably rebel against anyone who holds power over our daily lives. This internal contradiction means that the moment you ascend to power, the clock begins to tick. The group will initially project their grandest hopes onto you, elevating you to an impossible pedestal. But the very first time you make a necessary but unpopular decision, or the moment you display a human flaw, that idealized projection shatters. The adoration swiftly morphs into disappointment, and eventually into a simmering, restless contempt. Your followers will begin to look for your replacement before you have even settled into your role. To navigate this volatile landscape and forge a lasting, unbreakable bond with those you lead, you must look to the extraordinary reign of Queen Elizabeth I of England. When Elizabeth ascended to the throne in 1558, she inherited a realm that was financially bankrupt, militarily vulnerable, and violently fractured by religious fanaticism. Furthermore, she was a female monarch in a ruthlessly hyper-masculine era. The powerful noblemen who surrounded her, the seasoned courtiers, and the foreign ambassadors all viewed her with a mixture of predatory ambition and deep skepticism. They assumed she was merely a temporary figurehead, a fragile vessel who must immediately marry a strong prince to truly govern. Had Elizabeth attempted to rule through sheer tyrannical force, she would have instantly united these formidable men against her, sparking a disastrous civil war. Had she succumbed to their constant pressure and submitted to their guidance, she would have surrendered her power and become a royal puppet. Instead, Elizabeth engineered a masterful, unprecedented form of authority. She recognized that true power in such a precarious position must be entirely psychological. She began by cultivating a mesmerizing theatrical presence. She did not seek to be perceived as an ordinary, relatable woman. She transformed herself into a mythic icon, the Virgin Queen, wedded solely to her nation. She utilized dazzling spectacles, elaborate pageantry, and symbolic architecture to constantly reinforce this divine, larger-than-life aura. Yet this magnificent display was paired with a calculated, terrifying distance. She never allowed her courtiers to feel entirely secure in their positions. She was famously evasive, refusing to give definitive answers or commit to permanent alliances, keeping the men around her in a state of perpetual, desperate anticipation for her favor. She understood that familiarity destroys the mystique required for absolute rule. By remaining slightly elusive, by never fully revealing her inner thoughts or her ultimate strategies, she forced her followers to constantly project their awe and their fears onto her silent canvas. She ruled not by the sword, but by commanding the absolute, unbroken imagination of her people. The tragedy of the modern world is that we have largely forgotten this profound art. We suffer immensely from the entitlement curse. Modern leaders often acquire their positions through academic credentials, financial maneuvering, or a slow, bureaucratic ascent up the organizational chart. Once they secure the title of CEO, manager, or director, they make a fatal assumption. They believe the title itself is the source of their power. They expect respect and obedience simply because an official document dictates it. When this assumed loyalty inevitably fails to materialize, when their subordinates inevitably test their boundaries or exhibit apathy, the entitled leader reacts with either tyrannical micromanagement or desperate, pathetic attempts to be liked. They try to be everyone's friend, eroding the necessary distance required for leadership, or they rely on HR policies and punitive threats, revealing their profound internal weakness. They do not understand that authority is not a right granted by a system. It is a fragile, dynamic relationship that must be continuously earned, managed, and actively projected every single day. Establishing genuine, enduring authority requires the deliberate application of specific psychological strategies. First, you must completely abandon the idea of mimicking another leader's style. Authenticity is the bedrock of influence. If you attempt to copy the fiery rhetoric of a historic general when your true nature is quiet and analytical, your followers will instantly detect the performance. The dissonance between your core character and your public mask will make you appear profoundly weak and untrustworthy. You must excavate your own unique strengths, whether that is a brilliant strategic mind, an unyielding work ethic, or an extraordinary capacity for empathy, and elevate those traits to their absolute zenith, making them the signature of your reign. Second, you must become the living embodiment of the standard you demand. You cannot ask your team to work late while you leave early. You cannot demand meticulous attention to detail while you present sloppy, ill-conceived strategies. The leader must always lead from the front. When your followers see you enduring the same hardships, making greater sacrifices, and holding yourself to a standard of excellence that borders on the fanatical, their resistance evaporates. They are compelled to follow you not out of fear of punishment, but out of a deep, involuntary respect for your absolute commitment to the work. You must also master the subtle art of emotional regulation. A leader who panics, who lashes out in anger at every setback, or who constantly broadcasts their own anxieties instantly infects the entire group with instability. You must cultivate a stoic, unshakable demeanor. When a crisis strikes and the group is engulfed in fear, your calm, methodical presence becomes the vital anchor they desperately crave. They will naturally gravitate toward your emotional center of gravity. Ultimately, all external strategies are hollow without the foundation of the inner authority. You cannot inspire profound devotion in others if you do not possess a profound devotion within yourself. Inner authority is the unshakable, radiating conviction that you are intimately connected to a magnificent, transcendent life task. It is the quiet certainty that your work is not merely a job or a pursuit of fleeting wealth, but a necessary, vital contribution to the world. When you operate from this deeply anchored state, you do not need to raise your voice to command attention. You do not need to manipulate or coerce. Your intense focus, your unwavering discipline, and your absolute clarity of purpose generate a natural, almost mystical gravitational pull. People are fundamentally lost and hungry for meaning. When they encounter an individual who knows exactly who they are and precisely where they are going, they are irresistibly drawn into that orbit. They want to follow you because in your presence, they feel connected to a power and a purpose vastly greater than themselves. Chapter 16. See the hostility behind the friendly facade. We walk through a civilized world that aggressively promotes the virtues of cooperation, agreeableness, and mutual respect. We are taught from our earliest days to suppress our anger, to compromise, and to project a warm, friendly exterior. This societal conditioning is so absolute that we begin to believe the illusion ourselves. We assume that the pleasant smiles of our colleagues, the agreeable nods of our neighbors, and the collaborative language of our superiors are genuine reflections of their inner state. We blind ourselves to the profound reality of the law of aggression. Beneath the thin veneer of civilization, the human animal remains fiercely territorial, deeply ambitious, and relentlessly driven to expand its influence and secure its own survival. This primal energy cannot be legislated out of existence, nor can it be permanently extinguished by polite manners. When this innate drive for power, autonomy, or recognition is thwarted, when an individual feels overlooked, disrespected, or constrained, the aggressive energy does not simply evaporate. It mutates. It goes underground, hiding behind the very friendly facade we have been conditioned to trust, leaking out in subtle, highly destructive ways. To survive in this complex environment, you must radically adjust your perception. You must recognize that the most dangerous predators no longer wield physical weapons. They operate as sophisticated aggressors. In the modern arenas of business, politics, and social dynamics, overt hostility is heavily penalized. The sophisticated aggressor understands this perfectly. They have mastered the art of camouflage. They present themselves as the ultimate team player, the pious philanthropist, or the self-effacing servant of the greater good. They are often unfailingly polite, soft-spoken, and quick to defer to others in trivial matters. Yet behind this carefully constructed mask of harmlessness, they are executing ruthless, long-term campaigns of monopolization and control. They operate entirely through intermediaries, planting rumors, subtly shifting alliances, and maneuvering their rivals into impossible situations while keeping their own hands impeccably clean. They utilize the rules and bureaucratic structures of an organization not to maintain order, but as invisible weapons to suffocate their opponents. When the trap finally springs and their rival is marginalized or destroyed, the sophisticated aggressor will often be the first to offer a sympathetic, bewildered condolence, their friendly facade remaining entirely intact. To comprehend the sheer tenacity of this force, we must investigate the fundamental source of human aggression. It is not an aberration. It is deeply embedded in our evolutionary architecture. For millions of years, the survival of our ancestors depended on their capacity to forcefully assert control over a hostile, unforgiving environment. But the roots go deeper still, tracing back to the profound trauma of human infancy. We enter this world completely helpless, utterly dependent on giant figures to satisfy our most basic needs. This period of absolute vulnerability leaves a permanent psychological scar. To survive, the infant must learn to assert its will, demanding attention and resources through whatever means available. As we mature, this primal terror of helplessness remains buried in our unconscious. Our fundamental drive is to establish agency, to feel that we are the authors of our own fate, and to impose our will upon the world around us. When circumstances, restrictive rules, or the actions of others force us back into a state of feeling powerless or manipulated, this dormant terror is triggered. It instantly transforms into aggressive energy, a desperate, fiery attempt to reclaim control and soothe our internal anxiety. Because modern society strictly forbids the direct physical release of this energy, the vast majority of humanity channels it into the insidious shadow realm of passive aggression. This is the chosen warfare of those who feel chronically powerless, intensely insecure, or simply terrified of open conflict. They seek the emotional release of harming their target without assuming the risk or accountability of a direct attack. Passive aggression manifests in a maddening array of strategies. It is the colleague who agrees to a crucial deadline with a cheerful smile, only to consistently deliver late, incomplete work, utilizing intentional inefficiency to silently sabotage your project and assert their own hidden control. It is the friend who delivers a devastating insult disguised as a joke, forcing you to either swallow the offense or appear humorless and overly sensitive. It is the individual who conveniently forgets a vital promise, leaving you stranded while they retreat behind a wall of innocent apologies. Perhaps the most potent strategy of the passive aggressor is the weaponization of the victim role. By constantly portraying themselves as the injured party, misunderstood and perpetually suffering, they paralyze you with guilt. If you attempt to hold them accountable, you are instantly cast as the cruel oppressor. Dealing with these individuals is like fighting a ghost. The moment you try to strike back, they vanish into a cloud of deniability, leaving you exhausted, infuriated, and entirely off balance. To successfully counter passive aggression, you must completely alter your tactical approach. First and foremost, you must refuse the emotional bait. The passive aggressor is desperately trying to provoke you into an overt display of anger, allowing them to claim the moral high ground. You must maintain a cold, clinical detachment. Observe the pattern rather than reacting to the individual incident. Document the behavior meticulously.
When the time comes to address it, do so with calm, undeniable evidence, completely stripping away their plausible deniability. Establish absolute, uncompromising boundaries and enforce severe consequences when those boundaries are tested. By refusing to play their psychological game and forcing them into the harsh light of direct accountability, you neutralize their hidden power. However, the ultimate lesson of this law is not simply to become a defensive fortress against the hostility of others. You must also confront the aggressive energy residing within yourself. To attempt to permanently repress your own ambition, your own desire for power, or your own righteous anger is to render yourself helpless and easily victimized. It leads to a stagnant, depressed existence. The master of human nature engages in controlled aggression. This is the art of acknowledging the profound, fiery drive within your own soul and consciously harnessing it for your own elevation. Instead of allowing your frustration to leak out in petty, passive-aggressive squabbles or undirected rage, you funnel this immense pressure into relentless, productive action. Controlled aggression is the unyielding persistence required to conquer a massively difficult project. It is the courage to initiate bold, risky endeavors when others are paralyzed by caution. It is the fortitude to look an adversary in the eye and clearly, forcefully assert your boundaries and demands without apologizing. You train yourself to attack problems rather than people, channeling your primal need for conquest into the mastery of your craft and the expansion of your capabilities. By integrating this powerful, dangerous energy rather than denying it, you forge an unshakable inner strength, becoming an individual who is deeply civilized in manner yet entirely capable of fighting fiercely and effectively when the realities of the world demand it. Chapter 17. Seize the historical moment. We operate under the profound illusion that the values, beliefs, and attitudes we hold are the result of our own independent, rational conclusions. We imagine that our worldview is objective and that the way we perceive reality is simply the way reality is. This is the profound blindness dictated by the law of generational myopia. We are largely unaware of the extent to which our minds have been shaped by the specific historical moment into which we were born. You are a product of your generation. The overarching mood of the era during your formative years, the political crises, the economic conditions, the prevailing cultural rebellion or conformity, acted as an invisible mold, shaping your deepest assumptions about the world. Because everyone in your peer group was subjected to this exact same molding process, this shared perspective feels entirely natural and universal. We become trapped in the narrow corridor of our own generation's mindset, incapable of recognizing that our fiercely held convictions are often merely a collective, psychological reaction to the generation that preceded us.
We view the past with condescension and the future with anxiety, entirely failing to recognize the larger, cyclical tides of history that are silently dictating our present behavior. To understand the terrifying power of these historical currents, we must examine the tragic blindness of those who find themselves caught in the rising tide of a new era without the capacity to understand it. Consider the aristocracy of France in the years immediately preceding the Great Revolution. King Louis XVI and his court were entirely ensconced in the mindset of the past. They operated under the assumption that the absolute monarchy and the rigid, divinely ordained social hierarchy were permanent, unalterable facts of nature. They perceived the growing unrest, the bread riots, and the radical pamphlets not as the birth pangs of a completely new historical epoch, but merely as temporary, irritating disruptions of the established order. They attempted to solve the unprecedented crises of the late 18th century using the outdated, aristocratic tools of the 17th century. They were psychologically incapable of recognizing that the spirit of the times had profoundly shifted. The rising tide of egalitarianism, fueled by a new, frustrated generation of intellectuals and an impoverished populace, was an unstoppable, elemental force. Because the king and his courtiers could not adapt their perspective to this new reality, because they rigidly clung to the values of a dying age, they were violently swept away by the flood. Their myopia proved fatal. They were destroyed not simply by revolutionary armies, but by their total inability to read the shifting generational clock. This collective shift in perspective is not a mystical occurrence. It is a deeply grounded psychological reality known as the generational phenomenon. A generation is not merely a biological classification or a span of 20 years, it is a shared mental landscape. It is forged during the crucial developmental years of youth and early adulthood, when the mind is most plastic and intensely sensitive to the surrounding environment. During this period, a cohort of individuals experiences the same historical traumas, the same technological breakthroughs, and the same overarching cultural narratives. Crucially, they share the exact same parents, who were themselves molded by a previous era. If the parents were permissive and absent, the youth will collectively rebel by craving structure and tradition. If the parents were authoritarian and rigid, the youth will inevitably rebel by demanding radical freedom and tearing down institutions. This collective friction, this shared reaction to the immediate past, crystallizes into a distinct spirit of the times, a zeitgeist. It dictates the art that resonates, the political movements that gain traction, and the fundamental tone of societal interaction. You cannot escape this phenomenon. You can only choose whether to remain its blind instrument or to consciously understand and utilize its immense power. When we zoom out and observe human history not as a linear progression of random events, but as a continuous psychological evolution, we begin to perceive distinct generational patterns. The great 14th century philosopher Ibn Khaldun was among the first to map this cyclical dynamic. History moves in a continuous four-part rhythm, driven entirely by the shifting psychological needs of successive generations. The cycle inevitably begins with a generation of revolutionaries or pioneers. Forged in a period of severe crisis or societal decay, this generation possesses a burning, united purpose. They violently tear down the corrupt, stagnant institutions of the past and establish a new order, a new nation, or a new cultural paradigm. They are characterized by immense energy, stark ideological purity, and a profound capacity for sacrifice. However, the very success of this first generation sows the seeds of its own transformation. The second generation, raised in the immediate aftermath of the revolution or the crisis, inherits the new order. Having heard the harrowing tales of the past, they crave stability above all else. They are not revolutionaries, they are organizers and consolidators. They institutionalize the new values, build the bureaucratic structures, and focus on steady, material expansion. The fiery ideology of their parents cools into a rigid, comfortable orthodoxy. The third generation is born into this established, prosperous, and highly structured environment. Because they never experienced the original crisis, the institutions and values they inherit feel suffocating, hollow, and utterly disconnected from genuine struggle. They view the consolidated world of their parents with profound cynicism. This generation is deeply pragmatic, individualistic, and deeply critical of grand narratives. They begin to actively dismantle the ideological certainties of the past, prioritizing personal expression and material comfort over collective sacrifice. This cynical deconstruction inevitably weakens the societal fabric, setting the stage for the fourth generation. This cohort comes of age during a period of profound institutional decay, economic stagnation, or terrifying external threat. The individualism of the previous generation has left society fractured and incapable of meeting the crisis. Faced with absolute disaster, this fourth generation is forced to rediscover a collective purpose. They must abandon the cynicism of their parents and forge a new, radical solidarity to survive. In doing so, they become the new revolutionaries, completely destroying the crumbling order and resetting the historical clock, thereby birthing the first generation of a completely new cycle. To achieve mastery in the social realm, you must actively deploy strategies for exploiting the spirit of the times. You must first develop the capacity to accurately diagnose the current generational moment. Are you living in a period of revolutionary fervor, a time of rigid consolidation, an era of cynical individualism, or a profound crisis demanding a new order? Once you have identified the prevailing current, you must never attempt to swim directly against it. If you preach collective sacrifice to a cynical, individualistic third generation, you will be ignored. If you advocate for chaotic innovation to a second generation craving stability, you will be crushed. Instead, you must align your work, your message, and your endeavors with the unspoken hungers of the current era. You must become the articulate voice for the deep, unexpressed frustrations of your peers. Furthermore, you must anticipate the inevitable swing of the pendulum. By carefully observing the youth, who are actively reacting against the current orthodoxy, you can glimpse the shape of the next generational paradigm. The master anticipates this shift and positions themselves at the vanguard of the coming tide, appearing visionary simply because they understand the mechanical nature of human history. Yet, the ultimate goal of human development is not merely to ride the waves of your specific era, but to forge the human beyond time and death. To remain entirely defined by your generation is to remain a psychological prisoner. The most profound thinkers, artists, and leaders in history eventually break free from these temporal constraints. They achieve this liberation by deliberately expanding their perspective across centuries. They immerse themselves in the literature, the philosophy, and the struggles of distant eras, recognizing that the fundamental mechanics of human nature, our fears, our envies, our hunger for power, and our capacity for love, remain absolutely constant, regardless of the technological or political window dressing of the day. By anchoring your mind to these timeless, universal truths, you detach your ego from the petty, ephemeral dramas of the present moment. You cease to be a mere reactionary product of your specific time, and you become a trans-generational individual. You gain the profound, calming ability to view the chaotic unfolding of your own era with the detached, analytical grace of an immortal observer, utilizing the spirit of the times without ever being entirely consumed by it. Chapter 18. Meditate on our common mortality. The narrative of human existence is fundamentally shadowed by a singular, inescapable reality, our consciousness of our own end. Among all living creatures, we alone carry the profound, heavy burden of knowing that our time is strictly finite. This terrifying awareness creates a deep psychological friction, birthing the law of death denial. Rather than confronting this absolute certainty, we construct elaborate societal and psychological architectures to hide it from our daily view. We sequester the dying in sterile, hidden institutions. We worship youth and physical preservation, and we drown our quiet anxieties in a relentless torrent of digital distractions, petty social dramas, and the mindless accumulation of material wealth. We operate under the desperate, unspoken illusion that if we simply refuse to look at the approaching shadow, it will somehow cease to exist. Yet this aggressive repression exacts a devastating toll on our vitality. By denying death, we inadvertently deny the very urgency and preciousness of life itself. We become easily paralyzed by trivial setbacks. We harbor petty, long-lasting resentments, and we drift through our days with the assumption that we possess an infinite expanse of tomorrows. The repressed terror of our mortality mutates into a constant, low-grade anxiety that suffocates our daring and shrinks our horizons. To understand the transformative power of shattering this denial, we must look to the profound journey of the American writer Flannery O'Connor. In her mid-20s, just as her literary career was beginning to blossom, she was struck by a devastating diagnosis: lupus, the same incurable autoimmune disease that had slowly and agonizingly killed her father. The physicians offered her a grim prognosis of mere years to live. For a brief moment, the sheer terror of this reality threatened to crush her spirit, but O'Connor executed a monumental psychological pivot. Instead of retreating into bitter despair or seeking refuge in false hopes of a miraculous cure, she chose to look the approaching end squarely in the eye. This proximity to death became the defining crucible of her existence. It acted not as a paralyzing poison, but as an incredibly potent, clarifying serum. Knowing her time was violently curtailed, all trivial anxieties and social pretensions instantly evaporated. She could no longer afford the luxury of writer's block, petty jealousies, or the agonizing pursuit of universal approval. She possessed a singular, burning urgency to distill her vision into words before the darkness fell. Her impending death sharpened her perception, allowing her to see the tragicomedy of human nature with unparalleled clarity. She produced a body of literature characterized by its fierce, unsentimental brilliance, achieving a level of mastery in her abbreviated life that most writers never touch in 8 decades. O'Connor's experience reveals a profound paradox concerning the human condition. We view the awareness of death as a bullet in the side, a constant source of agonizing vulnerability that we must desperately try to ignore. We believe that looking at this wound will plunge us into a nihilistic despair. However, the exact opposite is true. When we courageously turn our gaze toward our own mortality, the bullet in the side transforms from a source of terror into the ultimate, unyielding anchor of reality. It instantly separates the monumental from the trivial. When you truly internalize the fact that you will die, the agonizing fear of failing a project, the sting of a colleague's insult, or the dread of public embarrassment are suddenly reduced to their proper, microscopic dimensions. You realize the absolute absurdity of wasting your profoundly limited heartbeats on resentment or the paralyzing fear of what others might think. The bullet becomes a constant physical reminder to sever your attachments to the petty and the superficial, forcing you to focus entirely on the essential work and the genuine connections that actually matter. To permanently escape the suffocating grip of denial, we must actively forge a philosophy of life through death. This is not a morbid obsession with our physical demise, but a supreme daily meditation on the ephemeral nature of all things. You must begin by consciously bringing the reality of death back into your daily awareness. When you part ways with a loved one, allow yourself the brief, poignant realization that this could be your final encounter. This thought does not breed despair, it breeds an intense, blinding appreciation for their presence in the immediate moment. It strips away the petty arguments and the taking for granted that poison long-term relationships. Furthermore, meditating on our common mortality is the ultimate solvent for human conflict and ego. When you look at your bitterest rival, your most difficult neighbor, or the strangers you pass on the street, recognize that they too are carrying the exact same burden. They are all hurtling toward the same inevitable silence. This shared fate is the only true equalizer. Recognizing it instantly dissolves the artificial boundaries of status, wealth, and ideology, fostering a profound, visceral empathy for the universal suffering and the desperate, fragile beauty of the human struggle. Finally, embracing this philosophy requires the total acceptance of reality in all its harshness and unpredictability. It is the cultivation of what the ancient Stoics called amor fati, the love of fate. You cease demanding that the universe conform to your desires. You accept the pain, the losses, and the inevitable end not with bitter resignation, but with a fierce, joyful embrace of the entire, magnificent catastrophe of existence. By looking continuously at the darkness of the grave, you inadvertently unlock the most radiant, fearless, and liberated version of yourself. You stop merely existing in a state of anxious preservation, and you finally truly begin to live.